My mother's voice was cheerful when she called, like she was sharing good news. "Dana, honey, you're not invited to Christmas this year. Rachel's new husband thinks you'd ruin the vibe. You understand, right?" I heard laughter in the background, clinking glasses, my father's voice saying something I couldn't quite catch. Then Rachel, my baby sister, giggling. "Just tell her mum. She'll get over it." I stood in my Seattle apartment phone pressed against my ear, watching snow fall outside my window. 36 years old, senior engineer at one of the biggest tech companies in the country. And my family was excluding me from Christmas because my sister's husband, a man I introduced to the family 10 years ago, as my boyfriend, decided I would ruin the vibe. The funny thing is, I didn't cry, I didn't beg, I didn't even raise my voice. I just smiled and said, "Mom, doesn't Rachel know?" The laughter stopped. I heard my mother's breath catch. Then Rachel grabbed the phone, her voice sharp with sudden fear. "No, what? Have you ever held a secret so long that releasing it felt less like revenge and more like finally exhaling?" My name is Dana Holland, and I'm 36 years old. I work as a senior software engineer at a major tech company in Seattle, a position I earned through 15 years of grinding my way up from entry-level programmer to leading complex projects that serve millions of users. On paper, I'm the definition of success: good salary, nice apartment respect from colleagues who actually know me. But to my family back in Ohio, I've always been something else entirely: the difficult one, the cold one, the daughter who somehow never quite fits. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like an eternity after my question. I could hear my mother breathing, could almost feel her searching for words she hadn't prepared. "Dana, don't be dramatic," she finally said, her voice taking on that familiar, dismissive tone I'd heard 1,000 times before. "There's nothing to know. We're just trying to keep things peaceful for Rachel. The pregnancy has been hard on her." I leaned against my kitchen counter, watching the Seattle skyline through my window. The city lights blurred slightly, though I refused to let the tears fall. I'd had a lifetime of practice holding them back. "Hard on her," I repeated quietly. "Of course." 3 weeks before Christmas, and my mother had called, not to ask how I was doing, not to discuss holiday plans, but to formally uninvite me from the family gathering. The excuse this year was Rachel's pregnancy. My younger sister apparently needed a stress-free environment, and my presence was considered incompatible with that goal. Never mind that I hadn't caused a single scene at any family event. Never mind that I'd spent years biting my tongue, swallowing insults, and pretending not to notice when my achievements were dismissed while Rachel's smallest accomplishments were celebrated like national holidays. "Your father and I talked about it," my mother continued, filling my silence with justifications I didn't ask for. "Matthew agrees it's for the best. Rachel's blood pressure has been elevated and the doctor said she needs to avoid stress. You know how things can get when you're around." I almost laughed. "Matthew agrees." Of course, Matthew agrees. Matthew, who had been my boyfriend before he became Rachel's husband. Matthew, who looked through me at family gatherings like I was a stranger he'd never met. Matthew, whose presence in my sister's life was a constant reminder of a betrayal so complete that my family had rewritten history to accommodate it. "When things get tense," I said carefully, "whose fault is that usually considered to be? Dana, please don't start." "I'm not starting anything, Mum. I'm asking a genuine question. When there's tension at family events, who gets blamed?" Another pause. I heard muffled voices, my mother's hand covering the phone as she spoke to someone else in the room. Then a rustling sound, and suddenly Rachel's voice came through sugar-sweet, with an edge sharp enough to cut glass. "Dana, hi Mum, hold me, she was going to call you. I hope you understand it's nothing personal. I just need everything to be perfect for the baby's first Christmas in utero." She laughed at her own joke, that tinkling laugh she'd perfected for audiences. "You get it right. We can do something after New Year's, maybe lunch or something." Maybe lunch. Like I was a distant acquaintance being penciled in for a courtesy meeting. I thought about all the things I'd never said. All the truths I'd buried to keep the family peace that never actually existed. All the secrets I'd kept, not because they protected me, but because exposing them would have destroyed the careful fiction everyone else preferred. Rachel, I said, my voice calm in a way that surprised even me. Are you sure you want to do this? Do what, Dana? I'm just trying to have a healthy pregnancy. Why do you always have to make everything about you? I'm asking if you're sure, because once certain conversations start, they can't be stopped. The sweetness drained from her voice. What is that supposed to mean? It means maybe Mom should ask you some questions before deciding who gets excluded from Christmas. I heard my mother gasp in the background, heard my father's confused murmur asking what was happening. And then Rachel's voice, no longer sweet, no longer controlled. What could you possibly have to say? For the first time in that conversation, I smiled. I didn't answer Rachel's question. I simply said goodnight and ended the call, leaving her screaming into dead air. Let her wonder. Let her spend the next 3 weeks trying to figure out what I meant. After 36 years of being dismissed, I had learned that silence could be its own kind of power. My apartment felt too quiet after I set the phone down. The Seattle rain had started again, tapping against my windows like impatient fingers. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the couch, staring at nothing in particular while my mind travelled back through years of memories I usually kept locked away. People always called me the strong one, the independent one. Dana doesn't need anyone, they would say, as if my self-sufficiency was a character flaw rather than a survival mechanism. What they didn't understand was that I became strong because I had no other choice. When your own family treats you like an afterthought, you either crumble or you build walls high enough to protect whatever is left of your heart. I thought about my 16th birthday. I had been so excited, convinced that 16 was special enough that even my family would remember. I woke up early that morning, put on my favourite dress, and came downstairs expecting balloons, or at least a card on the kitchen table. Instead, I found my mother rushing Rachel to a dance competition 2 hours away. Sorry, honey, we'll celebrate when we get back, she had called over her shoulder as they hurried out the door. They didn't get back until almost midnight. By then, I had already eaten a frozen dinner alone and gone to bed. No one mentioned my birthday the next day or the day after that. Eventually, I stopped expecting them to remember at all. College graduation was worse. I had worked so hard for that degree juggling classes and part-time jobs because my parents said they couldn't afford to help with tuition. I sent them tickets to the ceremony months in advance. I called to remind them twice. And then, 3 days before I was supposed to walk across that stage, my mother called to say they couldn't make it. Rachel had won some regional beauty pageant and the family was taking her to Florida as a celebration. You understand, right? She had said, this is such a big deal for your sister. You'll have other graduations. I never had another graduation, and I never forgot sitting in that auditorium, scanning the crowd for faces that weren't there, while the family behind me cheered so loudly for their daughter that I could barely hear my own name being called. Then there was the dress, the pale blue dress I had saved for months to buy, hanging in my closet for the company holiday party, where I was supposed to receive my first major promotion. I came home to visit for Thanksgiving that year, and when I went to pack for my return trip, the dress was gone. I found Rachel wearing it in the living room, twirling for our mother's camera. Oh, I thought you didn't want it anymore, my mother had said when I confronted her. It looks so much better on Rachel anyway. You're not really a dress person, Dana. I finished my wine and walked to my bedroom closet. In the back corner behind winter coats I rarely wore sat an old tin box covered in dust. I hadn't opened it in years. Some wounds heal better when you don't keep picking at them. But tonight, after that phone call, I needed to remember why I had stopped expecting anything from my family. I needed to remind myself that their rejection wasn't new. It was simply the latest chapter in a very long book. I carried the box to my bed and lifted the lid. Inside lay the artifacts of a life my family pretended didn't exist. Old photographs with curled edges, letters written in handwriting I still recognized, movie ticket stubs from dates that officially never happened, and underneath it all, a tarnished silver bracelet with a small charm shaped like a wave. I picked up the bracelet and held it to the light. Matthew had given it to me on our 1-year anniversary. We had spent the weekend at Cape Cod walking on the beach and talking about our future like it was something solid and real. He said the wave charm represented us always moving, always together, impossible to separate. I believed him. I believed everything he told me right up until the moment he disappeared from my life without explanation. My throat tightened as I set the bracelet aside and opened my laptop. There was a folder I kept hidden, buried deep into my file system, under a boring name that no one would ever think to click. I hadn't opened it in over a year, but I knew exactly what was inside. The folder was labelled simply Old Files. Inside were hundreds of photographs organised by date. I scrolled through them slowly, watching my younger self smile up at me from the screen. There I was, at 26, happier than I had ever been before or since. And there was Matthew, his arm around my shoulders, looking at me like I was the only person in the world who mattered. We had been so careful to document everything. Weekend trips, dinner dates, lazy Sunday mornings when we took selfies in bed just because we could. I had saved every photo because I wanted to remember how it felt to be loved completely, without reservation or conditions. I never imagined those same photos would become evidence of something my family would later deny ever existed. I kept scrolling until I reached the folder from our trip to Cape Cod. The weekend, Matthew gave me the bracelet. The weekend, I thought my life was finally beginning. I clicked on the first photo, and there we were, Matthew and me kissing on the beach at sunset. His hands were in my hair, my arms were wrapped around his neck. We looked like an advertisement for happiness, two people completely lost in each other. The timestamp in the corner read 10 years ago. 10 years since I had been that happy. 10 years since Matthew vanished from my life. 10 years since my sister announced her engagement to a man she claimed she had just met by coincidence. I stared at the photo until my vision blurred. Somewhere in Ohio, Rachel was probably still ranting about my cryptic comments demanding that our mother explain what I could possibly know. Let her wonder. Let her lose sleep over it. Because I had kept these photos hidden for a decade. I had stayed silent while my family rewrote history. I had watched Matthew become my brother-in-law and said nothing, swallowed my pain, smiled at their wedding like my heart wasn't shattering into 1,000 pieces. But silence has an expiration date, and mine was running out. I closed my laptop and lay back on my bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The photograph had unlocked something inside me, a door I had kept bolted shut for a decade. Now the memories came flooding through whether I wanted them or not, carrying me back to the beginning of everything. Back to when I still believed in happy endings and family loyalty, and the kind of love that lasts forever. I was 26 when I first met Matthew Caldwell. He had just been hired as a junior developer at my company, fresh out of graduate school with a degree in computer science, and absolutely no idea how to navigate corporate culture. My manager asked me to mentor him, show him the ropes, help him understand that writing good code was only half the job. I agreed, because I was trying to build my reputation as a team player, someone who could lead as well as execute. I had no idea that decision would change the entire course of my life. Matthew was different from the other new hires I had mentored before. He actually listened when I talked, asked thoughtful questions, and treated my advice like it mattered. Most young men in tech had a tendency to dismiss women, especially women who were only a few years older than them. But Matthew never made me feel like I had to prove myself. He respected my expertise from day one, and that respect slowly grew into something deeper. Our relationship developed gradually over the course of several months. Coffee meetings turned into lunch dates turned into after-work drinks. And then, one evening as we were walking to our cars after staying late to finish a project, he stopped in the middle of the parking garage and told me he had feelings for me. Real feelings not just professional admiration. He said he had been trying to ignore them because he didn't want to make things awkward, but he couldn't pretend anymore. I remember standing there in the fluorescent light, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. And then I kissed him because words seemed inadequate for what I was feeling. We kept our relationship private, at first not wanting to deal with office gossip or questions about professionalism. But outside of work, we were inseparable. Matthew was everything I had ever wanted in a partner. He was kind without being weak, ambitious without being ruthless, and he made me laugh in a way no one else ever had. For the first time in my life, I felt like someone truly saw me. Not the capable older sister, or the reliable co-worker, or the daughter who was never quite good enough. Just me. Just Dana. And he loved what he saw. After almost a year together, I made the decision to bring him home for Thanksgiving. It was a big step one I didn't take lightly. My family had never been particularly interested in my personal life, but I thought maybe this time would be different. Maybe if they met Matthew, if they saw how happy I was, they would finally treat me like I mattered. I wanted to share my joy with them. I wanted to belong. The visit started out fine. My parents were polite, if not exactly warm. My brother Tyler seemed genuinely happy for me and spent most of the evening asking Matthew about his work. But Rachel was different. I noticed it the moment she walked into the room and saw Matthew for the first time. Her eyes swept over him in a way that made my stomach tighten. Not the casual glance of a sister meeting her sibling's boyfriend, but something sharper, something hungry. She smiled and shook his hand and said all the right things, but I caught her watching him throughout dinner when she thought no one was looking. At the time, I told myself I was being paranoid. Rachel had always been the pretty one, the charming one, the one who could have any man she wanted. Why would she be interested in my boyfriend? After Thanksgiving, something unexpected happened. Rachel started calling me regularly, something she had never done before. She said she wanted to be closer to me, to have the kind of sisterly relationship we had never had growing up. She even started visiting me in the city, taking the bus from Ohio to spend weekends at my apartment. I was touched by this apparent change of heart. Finally, I thought my sister was seeing me as more than just competition or an afterthought. Finally, we could be real family. I didn't notice that her visits always seemed to coincide with times when Matthew was around. I didn't notice that she asked a lot of questions about our relationship, our schedules, our routines. I didn't notice that she had somehow gotten my phone password by watching me type it in. I was too busy feeling grateful that my family was finally accepting me. Too busy being naive. 3 months after Thanksgiving, Matthew stopped responding to my calls. At first, I thought he was just busy with a big project at work. Then, I thought maybe he was sick or dealing with a family emergency. I left voicemails. I sent texts. I even drove to his apartment one evening, only to find that his car was gone and his mailbox was overflowing. He had vanished from my life as suddenly and completely as if he had never existed. I was devastated, but I was also proud. Too proud to chase a man who obviously didn't want me anymore. Too proud to beg for explanations or closure. If Matthew could walk away without even a goodbye, then he wasn't the person I thought he was. I convinced myself that I had dodged a bullet, that his disappearance revealed a character flaw I had been too blind to see. I cried alone in my apartment for weeks, but I never reached out to him again. Some part of me was afraid of what I might discover if I pushed too hard. It was easier to accept the mystery than to face a truth that might destroy me. A year passed. I threw myself into work, earning promotions and accolades that meant nothing to me. I dated other men, but none of them came close to what I had felt with Matthew. I started to accept that maybe I just wasn't meant for love. Maybe I was destined to be the successful but lonely sister, the one who had her career but nothing else. Then, my mother called with news that stopped my heart. Her voice was bright with excitement, completely oblivious to the bomb she was about to drop. "Rachel is engaged," she announced. "You'll never guess who. That nice Matthew you introduced us to at Thanksgiving. Isn't that wonderful?" They ran into each other by coincidence and just fell in love. Your sister is finally getting her happy ending. I don't remember what I said after that. I don't remember hanging up or walking to my bathroom or staring at my reflection in the mirror. I only remember the sound of my own heartbeat roaring in my ears like a storm. The roaring in my ears didn't stop for days. I walked through my life like a ghost, going to work and coming home and lying awake at night, replaying my mother's words over and over until they lost all meaning. Rachel is engaged to Matthew. Your Matthew. The man who disappeared without a trace was apparently just waiting around the corner for your sister to find him. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that just perfect? I waited a week before calling Rachel. I needed time to gather myself to plan what I would say to prepare for whatever lies she might tell. When I finally dialed her number, my hands were steady but my heart was racing. She answered on the third ring, her voice bright and bubbly, the voice of a woman who had gotten everything she wanted. I didn't bother with pleasantries. I asked her directly if she knew that Matthew had been my boyfriend, if she understood that the man she was planning to marry had been in a serious relationship with her own sister just a year ago. I kept my voice calm, almost clinical, because I knew that any display of emotion would be used against me later. Rachel's response was so smooth, so perfectly rehearsed, that I knew she had been waiting for this conversation. She laughed softly and said she was so sorry I was confused, but Matthew had explained everything. According to him, we had never actually dated. I was just a colleague who mentored him when he first started at the company, and somewhere along the way, I had developed feelings that he didn't return. He tried to let me down gently, she said, but I became obsessed. I started following him, showing up at his apartment uninvited, making him uncomfortable. That's why he left the company. That's why he moved away. He was trying to escape my unwanted attention. I listened to her weave this fiction with growing horror. Every word was a knife, not because I believed it, but because I knew she did. Or at least she had convinced herself she did. Rachel had always been talented at rewriting reality to suit her needs. She could look you straight in the eye and tell you the sky was green and somehow make you feel crazy for thinking it was blue. I tried one more time. I told her about our anniversary trip to Cape Cod, about the bracelet Matthew gave me that still sat in a box in my closet, about the hundreds of photos on my phone that documented a real relationship, not some delusional fantasy. I offered to show her proof, to send her evidence that would expose Matthew's lies for what they were. Rachel's voice turned cold. She said I needed help. Professional help. She said it was sad watching me cling to a relationship that never existed, and she hoped I would get the therapy I clearly needed before I embarrassed myself any further. Then she hung up on me. My mother was even worse. When I called her desperate for someone in my family to believe me, she cut me off before I could even finish explaining. "Dana, don't be dramatic," she said with a sigh that suggested she had been expecting this call. "Matthew already told us about your little crush on him. He felt terrible about it, actually. He said you misunderstood his kindness for something more, and he didn't know how to tell you without hurting your feelings. That's why he transferred to a different company. He was trying to give you space to move on." I felt like I was drowning in quicksand. The more I struggled, the deeper I sank. Every piece of evidence I offered was dismissed or reinterpreted to fit the narrative Rachel had constructed. My photos were called doctored. My memories were called delusions. My pain was called jealousy over my sister's happiness. Within the span of a few phone calls, I had been transformed from victim to villain, from betrayed girlfriend to unstable stalker. What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't learn until years later, was that Rachel had taken one final step to ensure her story would never be challenged. She told Matthew that I was mentally unstable, that I had threatened to hurt myself when he stopped returning my calls, that my family was deeply worried about my psychological state and had begged her not to do anything that might push me over the edge. She painted me as fragile and dangerous, a ticking bomb that could explode at any moment if handled incorrectly. This lie served two purposes. It explained why I never reached out to Matthew directly, since he believed any contact from him might trigger a breakdown. And it ensured that Matthew would never reach out to me, never try to verify the silence that must have seemed so strange coming from a woman he once loved. Rachel had built a wall between us using my own supposed instability as the bricks. It was brilliant in its cruelty. She had stolen my boyfriend, my story, and my sanity all at once. The wedding invitation arrived 3 months later. I stared at it for hours, running my fingers over the embossed letters, the elegant script that spelled out Rachel and Matthew like a curse. Part of me wanted to burn it. Part of me wanted to show up and cause the scene everyone already expected from me. But in the end, I did neither. I put on a dress and drove to Ohio and sat at a corner table in the back of the reception hall, surrounded by distant relatives who barely remembered my name. I watched my sister dance with the man I loved. I watched my parents beam with pride. I watched Matthew look at Rachel the way he used to look at me, and I felt something inside me turn to stone. I could have stood up and screamed the truth. I could have shown everyone the photos on my phone, played the voicemails Matthew left me before he disappeared, forced them all to see the lies they had swallowed so eagerly. But I knew it wouldn't matter. In my family, Rachel's word was gospel, and mine was always suspect. They would find a way to explain away every piece of evidence, just like they always did. They would call me jealous, bitter, crazy. They would make me the villain of a story where I was actually the victim. So, I chose silence, not because I was weak, but because I was tired. Tired of fighting battles I could never win. Tired of begging for belief from people who had already made up their minds. I left the reception early, drove back to Seattle, and buried my evidence in a tin box at the back of my closet. 8 years have passed since that wedding. 8 years of watching Rachel post happy photos on social media. 8 years of hearing my mother brag about her perfect younger daughter. 8 years of carrying proof that could destroy everything Rachel built on lies. I never used it. I told myself I was taking the high road, being the bigger person, refusing to stoop to her level. But the truth is, I was scared. Scared that even with evidence, no one would believe me. Scared that exposing Rachel would only make me look pathetic and obsessed exactly the way she had painted me. But that was before the phone call. Before my mother told me I wasn't welcome at Christmas. Before Rachel's voice dripped with fake sweetness while she banished me from my own family. Something shifted inside me that night. The fear that had kept me silent for 8 years suddenly felt smaller than the anger that had been building all along. I still had the photos. I still had the messages. I still had the truth. And for the first time, I was ready to use it. The decision to finally use the truth felt like stepping off a cliff. I had spent so many years holding onto the edge, afraid of the fall, that I had forgotten there might be something waiting for me at the bottom. Maybe not safety, but at least solid ground. At least an end to the endless dangling. I spent the next few days going through everything I had saved. The photos on my laptop were damning enough, but I knew Rachel would find a way to dismiss them. She would claim they were edited or taken out of context or proof of nothing except my obsession. I needed something more, something undeniable, something that would crack the foundation of lies she had built over the past decade. That's when I remembered the phone. My old smartphone from 10 years ago was buried somewhere in my storage closet, shoved into a box of outdated electronics I had been meaning to recycle for years. I dug through tangled cables and dead laptops until I found it a scratched device with a cracked screen protector that felt like holding a time capsule. The battery was completely dead, but I still had a compatible charger in the same box. I plugged it in and waited, my heart pounding as the screen slowly flickered to life. The phone took forever to boot up. I paced my apartment while it loaded, trying not to get my hopes up. After 10 years, the data might be corrupted. The messages might be gone. This could all be a waste of time, just another dead end in a decade of dead ends. But then, the home screen appeared, and I saw the notification badge on my messaging app. 47 unread messages. My hands were shaking as I opened the app. The messages were all from Matthew, sent over the course of 3 weeks, about 10 years ago. 3 weeks when I thought he had abandoned me without explanation. 3 weeks when I cried myself to sleep, wondering what I had done wrong. 3 weeks when he was apparently trying desperately to reach me. The first few messages were casual, the kind of texts any boyfriend might send. "Hey, haven't heard from you today. Everything okay?" Then they became more concerned. "Dana, I've called 3 times. Is your phone broken? Did something happen?" Then confused. "I don't understand. What did I do? Please just talk to me." Then desperate. "Dana, please, whatever I did, I'm sorry. Just tell me what's wrong. I can't fix it if you won't tell me what's wrong." I scrolled through message after message, each one more heartbreaking than the last. Matthew had poured his heart out to a woman he thought was ignoring him. He had apologized for offenses he never committed. He had begged for an explanation that never came. And I had never seen any of it. These messages had been deleted from my notifications the moment they arrived, erased by someone who had access to my phone and wanted to make sure I never knew Matthew was trying to reach me. The final message made me stop breathing. "I'm sorry for whatever I did to make you want to end things," he wrote. "I thought we had something real, but I guess I was wrong. I won't bother you anymore. I hope you find what you're looking for. Goodbye, Dana." I read those words 5 times before I understood what they meant. Matthew thought I had ended things. He thought I had rejected him, not the other way around. All this time, I believed he abandoned me without warning. But in his mind, I was the one who walked away. I checked the sent folder with a growing sense of dread. There it was, near the top of the list, a message I had no memory of writing. "Matthew, I think we should stop seeing each other. This isn't working for me anymore. Don't contact me again." The timestamp was from a weekend when Rachel had been visiting a Saturday afternoon when she borrowed my phone to make an urgent call to a friend whose number she didn't have memorized. She had asked so sweetly, so innocently, "Could I borrow your phone for just a minute? Mine died and I really need to reach someone." I handed it over without hesitation, grateful that my sister was finally making an effort to be close to me. She must have worked quickly. Send the message, delete the confirmation, clear it from my notifications, and hand the phone back with a smile. "Thank you so much. You're the best." I had no reason to check my sent folder. I had no idea she had just detonated my entire relationship with a few taps of her fingers. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Rachel hadn't just stolen my boyfriend. She had engineered the entire breakup, manipulating both of us like puppets. She made Matthew believe I rejected him, then swooped in to comfort his broken heart. She made me believe he abandoned me, ensuring I would be too proud and too hurt to ever reach out and discover the truth. It was surgical in its precision. She had identified the exact vulnerability in our relationship and exploited it with terrifying efficiency. I sat on my closet floor surrounded by old boxes, clutching that cracked phone like a lifeline. 10 years. For 10 years, I had blamed myself for not seeing the signs for falling for a man who could walk away so easily. For 10 years, Matthew had probably blamed himself too, wondering what he did to drive me away. And all along, we were both victims of my sister's cruelty. I started going through the rest of the phone, looking for anything else I might have missed. Old photos, calendar entries, notes. And then I opened the voice memo app and saw a recording I didn't remember making. It was dated from the same weekend Rachel borrowed my phone just a few hours after the fake breakup text was sent. I pressed play, and my sister's voice filled my apartment. She was talking to someone probably on another phone, laughing in that careless way she always did when she thought she had won. "Oh my God, it was so easy," she said. "I just sent him a text from her phone and deleted it. She has no idea. Neither does he. By next week, he'll be crying on my shoulder about how his girlfriend dumped him out of nowhere. And then I'll be there to pick up the pieces." The recording cut off abruptly, probably triggered accidentally when Rachel was handling my phone. But it was enough. More than enough. I had my proof. After 10 years, I finally had proof that no one could dismiss or explain away, and I knew exactly what I was going to do with it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my bedroom floor with my back against the wall, listening to Rachel's recorded laughter over and over until the words lost their meaning and became just sounds. Pure, distilled cruelty wrapped in my sister's familiar voice. She had known exactly what she was doing. This wasn't impulsive jealousy or a moment of weakness. This was a calculated campaign to destroy my happiness while keeping her own hands clean. The sun came up and I was still sitting there, my phone battery nearly dead from replaying that recording. My eyes burned from exhaustion, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. The fog of self-doubt that had surrounded me for a decade was finally lifting. I wasn't crazy, I wasn't obsessive, I wasn't the unstable sister who couldn't let go of a man who never wanted her. I was a victim of deliberate sabotage, and the person who did it was currently pregnant with Matthew's child and planning a perfect family Christmas without me. As I finally got up to make coffee, I remembered something else. 3 years ago, I had received an unexpected email from Megan Shaw, Rachel's best friend from college. They had some kind of falling out over money, or a man, or both. The details were never clear to me. But Megan had sent me an audio file with a short message that said, "I thought you should know who your sister really is." I saved the file, but never listened to it. At the time, I was trying so hard to move forward to build a life that didn't revolve around what Rachel had taken from me. Opening old wounds seemed pointless when I had already accepted my losses and moved on. But now, everything was different. Now I had proof that the losses I accepted were based on lies. Now I needed to understand the full scope of what my sister had done. I found Megan's email buried in an old folder and downloaded the audio file. It was longer than the accidental recording on my phone, almost 5 minutes of Rachel talking freely to someone she trusted. I would listen to it later when I was ready to absorb whatever new horrors it contained. For now, I needed to think about my next move. My first instinct was to call Rachel and play her own words back to her, to watch her squirm as she realised her perfect mask had finally cracked. But that would give her time to prepare to craft new lies to spin the situation in her favour the way she always did. Rachel was a master of manipulation. If I gave her any warning, she would find a way to turn my evidence against me. No, I needed to be smarter than that. I needed to plant seeds of doubt before the confrontation, to shake the foundation of her carefully constructed world. Not revenge, I told myself. Revelation. I didn't want to destroy my family. I just wanted the truth to breathe, after being suffocated for so long. I started with something small. I printed out one of the photos from Cape Cod, the same image I had been looking at on my laptop, me and Matthew with our arms around each other clearly in love. I put it in a plain envelope with no return address, and mailed it to my parents' house with just one word written on the back of the photo. Remember. Let my mother see that image and try to convince herself it didn't mean anything. Let my father wonder why his elder daughter was sending mysterious photographs. Let Rachel walk in and find them staring at evidence of a relationship she swore never existed. Next, I thought about Tyler. My younger brother had always been caught in the middle, too afraid of our mother's disapproval to ever take my side openly, but never actively cruel the way Rachel was. He called me on my birthday every year, even when no one else did. He sent awkward text messages after family events, apologising for how I was treated. He was weak, but he wasn't malicious, and he owed me more than he knew. I had kept the receipts from his college tuition payments in a folder with all my financial records. 4 years of tuition at Ohio State paid in full by an anonymous donor. Tyler probably assumed our parents found a way to cover it, or that he had received some scholarship he never applied for. The truth was simpler and sadder. I paid for my brother's education because our parents said they couldn't afford it, and because I didn't want him to start his adult life drowning in debt. I never told anyone. I never expected gratitude. But now it was time for Tyler to know who had really been looking out for him all these years. I made copies of every receipt and bank transfer, put them in an envelope and mailed them to Tyler's apartment with a sticky note that said, "I thought you should know." The waiting was the hardest part. I went to work and pretended everything was normal. I answered emails and attended meetings and smiled at colleagues who had no idea that my entire life was about to implode. At night, I came home and stared at my phone, wondering when the first domino would fall. It took 3 days for Tyler to call. His voice was strange when I answered, tight and shaky, like he was trying not to cry. "I got your envelope," he said without any greeting. "Dana." I had no idea. All this time, I thought Mum and Dad figured something out. I thought maybe there was a college fund I didn't know about. Why didn't you ever tell me? I told him it didn't matter why. I told him I wasn't looking for thanks or repayment. I just wanted him to understand that our family's version of events didn't always match reality. That maybe, just maybe, he should question some of the things he had been told about me over the years. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Tyler finally spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "There's something I need to tell you, Dana. Something I should have said 6 years ago. I've been carrying it around like a weight on my chest, and after what you just showed me, I can't keep it inside anymore." I gripped my phone tighter. "What is it, Tyler?" "What happened 6 years ago?" He took a deep breath. "It's about Rachel and your job, and why you really got fired." I sank onto my couch as Tyler's words hung in the air between us. My job, 6 years ago. The sudden termination that came out of nowhere, right when my career was finally taking off. I had spent months replaying every interaction, every project, every email, trying to figure out what I had done wrong. The company gave me nothing but vague explanations about restructuring and budget cuts, but I knew it was personal. I just never knew how personal it really was. Tyler started talking, and once he began, the words poured out like water breaking through a dam. He told me about a weekend 6 years ago when he was home visiting our parents. Rachel was there too, on the phone in the backyard, and Tyler was in the kitchen with the window cracked open. He wasn't trying to eavesdrop. He just happened to hear. "She was laughing," he said. "That smug laugh she does when she thinks she's gotten away with something. She was telling someone about an email she sent to your company. Anonymous from a fake account. She said she reported you for stealing ideas from co-workers and having an inappropriate relationship with your supervisor. She was bragging about how clever she was, how no one would ever trace it back to her." I felt sick. 6 years ago, I had been featured in our local Ohio newspaper for leading a breakthrough project at work. My mother had actually called to congratulate me, which was so rare that I saved the voicemail. It was one of the only times she ever acknowledged my professional success. But Rachel must have seen that article too. She must have read about her older sister's accomplishments and felt that familiar surge of envy that had poisoned every good thing in my life. The accusations Tyler described were completely fabricated. I never stole anyone's ideas. I never had any kind of relationship with my supervisor beyond professional respect. But companies don't like controversy, especially tech companies worried about their public image. Someone in HR must have decided it was easier to quietly eliminate the problem than to investigate whether the anonymous allegations were true. They called it restructuring. They gave me a decent severance package and a neutral reference letter, and I walked away with my reputation technically intact, but my confidence shattered, convinced that I had somehow failed, without understanding how. I asked Tyler why he never told me. Why he waited 6 years to share something that could have changed everything. His voice cracked as he answered. "I was 26, Dana. I had no job, no savings, nothing. I was living in Mum and Dad's basement trying to figure out my life. When I heard Rachel on that call, I wanted to tell you. I really did, but I was scared. You know how Mum is about Rachel. If I accused her golden child of something like that, Mum would have thrown me out. I convinced myself I must have misheard. I told myself there was no way Rachel would do something that evil to her own sister. It was easier to believe I was wrong than to face what it would mean if I was right. I understood his fear, even as I hated him for his cowardice. Tyler had always been the peacekeeper, the one who avoided conflict at any cost. He watched me get pushed aside his entire life and never said a word because saying something would have made him a target too. I couldn't entirely blame him. Our family had taught us all that survival meant staying on Rachel's good side. But then Tyler said something that made my blood run cold. "There's something else," he continued, his voice dropping even lower. A few days after I heard that phone call, Mum came to me. She was upset, pacing around the kitchen. She said she found something on Rachel's computer when she borrowed it to check her email. A draft of the message Rachel sent to your company. Mum saw the whole thing, Dana. She knew exactly what Rachel did. I couldn't breathe. I asked Tyler what our mother did with that information, already knowing the answer, but needing to hear it anyway. "Nothing," Tyler said. She did nothing. She deleted the draft from Rachel's computer, so there wouldn't be any evidence. Then she sat me down and told me to keep my mouth shut. She said you were strong, that you'd find another job, that there was no point in tearing the family apart over something that couldn't be undone. She said Rachel was fragile and needed protection, and that you could handle it because you had always handled everything. The room seemed to tilt around me. My own mother had seen proof that Rachel destroyed my career with lies, and her response was to cover it up, to protect the daughter who committed the crime, while sacrificing the daughter who was victimized by it. I had spent my entire life feeling like an outsider in my own family, but this was something beyond exclusion. This was active betrayal. This was my mother looking at evidence of injustice and choosing to let me suffer rather than hold Rachel accountable. I asked Tyler why he was telling me now after all these years of silence. He said the tuition receipts changed something in him. Seeing proof that I had paid for his education without ever asking for credit or acknowledgement made him realize how wrong he had been. He said he couldn't keep living with the guilt, especially knowing that I was still being punished for crimes I never committed while Rachel enjoyed the life she had stolen. I thanked him for finally telling me the truth, even though part of me wanted to scream at him for waiting so long. But before I could say anything else, Tyler interrupted me. "There's more," he said, and his voice broke completely. "The house Dana. Mum and Dad almost lost it 2 years ago. Dad's accident, the medical bills, all the debt they couldn't pay. The bank was going to foreclose. Do you know who saved it?" I was silent, my heart pounding. Tyler continued, almost whispering now. "I've been trying to figure it out for 2 years. Mum thinks the bank just gave them an extension, but that's not what happened. Someone paid off their entire debt through some kind of legal company. I could never trace who it was." He paused, and I heard him take a shaky breath. "Dana, was it you? Did you save our parents' house after everything they did to you?" I closed my eyes and leaned back against the couch cushions. Tyler's question echoed through the phone line, waiting for an answer he probably already suspected. 2 years of wondering who saved our parents' house, and now he was finally connecting the dots. I could have lied. I could have let him keep guessing, but I was so tired of secrets, so exhausted by the weight of truths I had carried alone for so long. "Yes," I said quietly. "It was me." The silence on Tyler's end lasted so long that I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. He asked me how and why and what on earth possessed me to save the people who had treated me like a burden my entire life. I told him to sit down because it was a long story. Then I explained everything. 2 years ago, Tyler had called me in a panic late one night. Dad's accident had left him unable to work for months, and the medical bills had piled up faster than anyone expected. Mum tried to hide how bad things were, but Tyler found the foreclosure notice stuffed in a kitchen drawer. The bank was giving them 60 days to catch up on 6 months of missed mortgage payments, plus penalties and fees. The total amount owed was over $150,000, an impossible sum for a family that had been living paycheck to paycheck even before the accident. Tyler begged me for advice, not money. He knew I had a good job, but he had no idea how much I had saved over the years. I told him I would look into their options, maybe find a lawyer who could negotiate with the bank or a non-profit that helped families facing foreclosure. What I didn't tell him was that I had already made up my mind before we hung up. I spent the next week working with a law firm that specialised in discreet financial interventions. They handled everything through a trust account that couldn't be traced back to me. The bank received full payment of all outstanding debts, and my parents received a letter explaining that an anonymous benefactor had settled their account. I instructed the lawyers to make it seem like a charitable organisation had stepped in the kind of feel-good story that occasionally made local news. My parents never questioned it. They assumed they had gotten lucky, that some wealthy stranger had taken pity on them, that God or fate had intervened at the last moment. They never once considered that their invisible eldest daughter might have been watching over them from 1,000 miles away. Tyler asked me how I could afford it. I explained that I had been living below my means for years, saving and investing carefully, because I learned early that I couldn't rely on anyone else. I didn't own a house or a fancy car. My apartment was modest, my lifestyle simple. The money I would have spent on luxuries went into accounts that grew steadily over time. When the foreclosure notice came, I had enough to cover it without destroying my own financial security. It hurt, but it was manageable. But why Tyler pressed? After everything they did to you, after Mum covered up what Rachel did to your career, after they excluded you and blamed you and made you feel worthless for 30 years. Why would you save them? I thought carefully before answering. This was the question I had asked myself 100 times while signing the paperwork that transferred my savings to that law firm. Why help people who had never helped me? Why sacrifice for a family that treated me like a stranger? Because my worth isn't determined by their acknowledgement. I finally said, I didn't save the house to earn their love or prove a point or make them feel guilty. I saved it because I couldn't watch my elderly parents become homeless regardless of how they treated me. That's who I am, Tyler. I do the right thing even when no one is watching, even when I'll never get credit, even when the people I help don't deserve it. If I only showed kindness to people who earned it, I wouldn't be any different from them. Tyler was crying now. I could hear him trying to muffle the sounds the way men do when they're ashamed of their own emotions. He said he didn't deserve a sister like me. He said he spent his whole life standing by while I was mistreated, and I still paid for his education and saved our parents' home and never asked for anything in return. He said he was sorry over and over, as if the words could somehow undo decades of passive betrayal. I told him that his apology meant more than he knew, but that I didn't need him to feel guilty. I needed him to understand. I needed someone in my family to finally see the truth about who I was and who Rachel was. Not so I could be praised or vindicated, but so I wouldn't feel so alone anymore. So at least one person would know that the family narrative was built on lies. Tyler took a shaky breath and said he understood. He said he was done being silent, done enabling Rachel, done pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. And then he hesitated, and I could tell there was something else on his mind. Dana, he said slowly, I need to ask you something else. 4 years ago, Matthew's startup was about to fail. He was going to lose everything. He and Rachel were fighting constantly about money, and I heard her screaming at him that she didn't sign up to be married to a failure. Then, out of nowhere, some mysterious investor showed up and saved the company. Anonymous, just like the person who saved Mum and Dad's house. Matthew could never figure out who it was. He said it came through some kind of business LLC that he couldn't trace. Tyler paused and I heard him swallow hard. Dana, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Please tell me that wasn't you too. Please tell me you didn't save the man who married your sister after she stole him from you. Please tell me you have some limit to how much you're willing to sacrifice for people who don't deserve it. I didn't answer right away. The silence stretched between us, filled with all the complicated truths I had never spoken aloud. Finally, I took a deep breath and prepared to tell my brother about the hardest decision I had ever made. The silence on the phone stretched so long that I could hear Tyler's breathing shallow and anxious, waiting for me to deny what he suspected. I wished I could give him the answer he wanted. I wished I could tell him that I had limits, that there were lines even I wouldn't cross, that I would never be foolish enough to save the man who broke my heart and the sister who orchestrated its breaking. But I had promised myself no more lies, not even comfortable ones. Yes, I said finally. The investor was me. Tyler made a sound that was half laugh and half sob. He asked me if I had lost my mind. He asked if I was some kind of saint or martyr or just someone who enjoyed being walked over. His voice rose with each question, frustration and disbelief tangling together until he ran out of words and just sat there breathing heavily on the other end of the line. I waited until he calmed down before I explained. 4 years ago, you called me worried about Mum and Dad, I began. You said Matthew's company was failing and Rachel was threatening to leave him if he couldn't turn things around. You said she was already hinting that she might need to move back home with the kids she was planning to have, that Mum and Dad would have to support her because Matthew couldn't. You were terrified that our parents would bankrupt themselves trying to take care of Rachel, and you didn't know what to do. Tyler was quiet now, listening. I looked into Matthew's company, I continued. It wasn't hard to find information about it online. He had a good product and a solid team, but he was running out of capital at the worst possible time. Investors were scared the market was uncertain, and no one wanted to take a risk on a small startup that might not survive the year. Without a significant cash injection, the company would collapse within months. I did the math, Tyler. If Matthew's business failed, Rachel would leave him because Rachel only loves winners. She would come crawling back to Ohio with nothing, expecting Mum and Dad to pick up the pieces the way they always did. Our parents would drain their retirement savings trying to help her. They'd take out loans they couldn't afford, maybe even mortgage the house again. And eventually, everything would collapse and I'd be watching from 1,000 miles away while our whole family went down in flames. I invested $200,000 through an LLC that couldn't be traced to me. The money went into Matthew's company as angel funding from what appeared to be a small investment firm interested in tech startups. He never knew where it really came from. Neither did Rachel. They just thought they got lucky the same way my parents thought they got lucky when someone saved their house. Tyler finally found his voice. He asked me how I could do it, how I could send my own money to help the man who abandoned me and the sister who stole him, how I could watch them prosper on my investment without ever revealing the truth. I told him it was the hardest thing I ever did. Signing those papers felt like swallowing broken glass. Every instinct I had screamed at me to let them fail to watch from a distance, while karma finally caught up with the people who had hurt me most. Part of me wanted Rachel to suffer. Part of me wanted Matthew to lose everything, so he would know how it felt to have his life torn apart by forces beyond his control. The bitterness was so strong I could taste it metallic and sharp on my tongue. But I didn't do it for them, I explained. I did it for Mum and Dad, who would have destroyed themselves trying to rescue Rachel from her own choices. I did it for Tyler, who would have been caught in the middle of another family crisis. And I did it for myself because I needed to prove that I wasn't the person Rachel tried to turn me into. She wanted me to become bitter, I continued. She wanted me to become so consumed by resentment that I would shrink and harden and turn into someone small. Every time she took something from me, she expected me to respond with hatred. That's what she would have done in my position. That's the only language she understands. But I refused to let her define me. I refused to let her cruelty transform me into a lesser version of myself. When I saved Matthew's company, I wasn't being weak or naive. I was choosing who I wanted to be. I was proving to myself that I could look at the people who hurt me most and still act with integrity, not because they deserved it, but because I deserve to be the kind of person who does the right thing even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Tyler was crying again. He said he didn't understand how I could be so strong after everything I'd been through. He said most people would have crumbled under half the weight I'd carried. He said he was ashamed of his own weakness, ashamed that he stood by and watched while I was systematically erased from our family. I told him shame wasn't useful unless it led to change. I told him he could start making things right by standing with me now, by being willing to face the truth, even when it was uncomfortable. And I told him that I was done waiting for my family to see me. I was done hoping they would someday acknowledge what I'd done for them. I was done being invisible. After we hung up, I sat alone in my apartment for a long time, thinking about everything that had happened and everything that was about to happen. The recordings, the evidence, Tyler's confessions, the years of sacrifice that no one knew about except me, and now my brother. All of it swirled together in my mind, forming a picture that was finally complete. I opened my laptop and navigated to a travel booking website. My fingers moved across the keyboard, almost without conscious thought, entering dates and destinations and payment information. When I finished, a confirmation email appeared in my inbox. 1 round-trip ticket to Columbus, Ohio. Departure, December 24th. Return open-ended. I closed the laptop and looked out my window at the Seattle skyline glittering in the winter darkness. This year, I was going home for Christmas, whether they wanted me there or not. The flight to Columbus was uneventful, which gave me too much time to think. I watched the clouds drift past my window and rehearsed what I would say, how I would act, what I would do when I saw Rachel's face. By the time we landed, I had run through 100 different scenarios, but none of them felt quite right. Some things you just can't prepare for. Some moments you have to meet as they come. I rented a car at the airport and drove the familiar route to my childhood home. The roads were quieter than usual, most people already settled in with their families on Christmas Eve. Snow dusted the fields on either side of the highway and Christmas lights twinkled from farmhouses in the distance. It would have been beautiful if I weren't driving toward the most difficult confrontation of my life. I pulled onto my parents' street just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed almost too perfect, like a postcard from a life I had never actually lived. Their house looked exactly as I remembered, a 2-story colonial with green shutters and a wreath on the front door. Cars lined the driveway and spilled onto the street, evidence of the extended family gathering I had been explicitly excluded from. I sat in my rental car for a full 5 minutes, watching shadows move behind the curtained windows. I could hear music and laughter, even from out here, the sounds of a celebration I wasn't supposed to witness. Part of me wanted to drive away, to spend Christmas alone in a hotel room the way I had so many years before. It would be easier, safer, less painful for everyone involved. But I was done taking the easy path. I was done making myself small so others could feel comfortable. I grabbed the gift box from the passenger seat and walked up the driveway before I could change my mind. The doorbell echoed through the house, and the laughter inside dimmed slightly as someone moved to answer. I heard my mother's voice calling out that she would get it, heard her footsteps approaching, heard the click of the lock turning. Then the door swung open and my mother stood there in her best holiday dress, a glass of wine in her hand and a smile on her face that froze the instant she saw me. Dana. She said my name like it was a curse, like I was a ghost who had risen from a grave she thought she had sealed forever. "What are you doing here?" I smiled calmly. "Merry Christmas, Mum. I came to see my family." Before she could respond, Rachel appeared behind her, drawn by the sudden silence. Her expression cycled through surprise, then forced warmth, then something cold and calculating as she realized guests were watching. "Dana," she exclaimed loudly enough for everyone to hear. "What a wonderful surprise. You should have told us you were coming." She stepped forward and air-kissed my cheek, using the motion to bring her lips close to my ear. "Leave now," she whispered, her voice like ice. "You're ruining everything. Don't you dare embarrass yourself in front of everyone." I pulled back and smiled at her the same way she always smiled at me, sweet and sharp at the same time. "I wouldn't miss Christmas with my family for anything, Rachel. Isn't that what the holidays are about?" I stepped past both of them into the house before they could block me. The living room was filled with people I hadn't seen in years, aunts and uncles and cousins who looked up with varying expressions of surprise. Aunt Jenny, my father's sister, who had always been kind to me, rose from her chair with genuine delight on her face. "Dana, oh my goodness," she exclaimed, crossing the room to embrace me. "It's been so long. We thought you weren't coming this year. Your mother said you had to work." I glanced at my mother, who was still standing by the door with a stricken expression. "I managed to get time off at the last minute," I said. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Intruding." Aunt Jenny waved her hand dismissively. "Don't be silly. Your family. Here, come. Sit by me. Tell me everything you've been up to." I spent the next hour moving through the room, greeting relatives who seemed genuinely happy to see me. Cousins asked about my job and my life in Seattle. Uncle Robert remembered a conversation we had years ago about engineering and wanted to hear about my latest projects. A great aunt, whose name I barely remembered, pulled me aside to say she had always thought I was the smart one in the family and wished we saw each other more often. What struck me most was how surprised they all seemed. Not just that I was there, but that I was normal, pleasant, easy to talk to. I could see them reconciling the person in front of them with whatever stories they had been told, and I could see the confusion when the two images didn't match. This was the woman Rachel called difficult. This was the daughter Margaret said was too busy and important to bother with family gatherings. Something didn't add up, and I could see the questions forming behind their polite smiles. I waited until the room was at its fullest, until everyone had gathered in the living room for the gift exchange that was our family tradition. Then I walked to the centre table, where presents were piled, and placed my small box among them. "What's that?" Aunt Jenny asked, eyeing the simple wrapping and handwritten label. "Just a family memory that was almost lost forever," I said, keeping my voice light and casual. I thought everyone might want to see it. Rachel had been watching me from across the room, her face a mask of controlled hostility. But as her eyes fell on the box as she read the words I had written on the lid, the colour drained from her face so completely that I thought she might faint. The label said simply, "Thanksgiving 2014, Cape Cod," a time and place that Rachel had sworn never existed, a memory she had worked so hard to erase. She looked at me with something new in her eyes now, not anger, not contempt, fear. And for the first time in 10 years, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Rachel's fear was visible now, written across her face in a way she couldn't hide. She started moving toward the table, clearly intending to grab the box before anyone else could open it. But Aunt Jenny was faster. Her curiosity had already gotten the better of her, and she lifted the lid before Rachel could intervene. "Oh my goodness," Aunt Jenny breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. "Is this the old family album, Margaret? I thought you said this was lost years ago." My mother stepped forward, confusion replacing the controlled smile she had been wearing since I arrived. "What are you talking about?" "The album disappeared during one of our moves. I looked everywhere for it." Aunt Jenny lifted the album from the box and held it up so others could see. It was unmistakably the one that had documented our family history for decades, the brown leather cover worn soft with age, the gold lettering on the spine faded but still readable. But as she opened it and began turning pages, her expression shifted from delight to horror. The album had been mutilated. Pages were torn, some ripped out entirely, others defaced with crude cuts that removed specific sections. And every single photograph that had once contained me had been systematically destroyed. Some were cut cleanly with scissors, others torn as if in rage, but the pattern was undeniable. Wherever I had appeared in the family record, I had been erased. I watched the room process what they were seeing. Aunt Jenny's hands trembled as she turned pages, revealing gap after gap where photos should have been. Uncle Robert leaned in, his brow furrowed with confusion. Cousins whispered to each other, pointing at the obvious damage. And my mother stood frozen, her face pale, unable to look away from the evidence of destruction. "I found this album 3 years ago," I said, keeping my voice calm and steady. "Rachel was moving to a new apartment and asked me to help. I found it in a trash bag she was planning to throw away. When I asked about it, she said it was just old junk she was getting rid of. I didn't look inside until I got home." Rachel's voice cut through the murmuring. That's not true. The album was already damaged when I found it. Someone must have done that before, maybe when we were kids. I was just throwing away something that was already ruined. I let her words hang in the air for a moment before responding. Then why did you tell me it was junk you were getting rid of? Why not say you found a damaged family album that needed to be repaired? And why would anyone cut out only the photos containing me? Tyler had been standing near the back of the room, but now he pushed forward and took the album from Aunt Jenny's hands. He turned to a specific page, one I remembered well, and his voice cracked when he spoke. This was my 5th birthday, he said loud enough for everyone to hear. He held up the album so they could see the torn page, the gap where a photograph had once been. Dana was in this picture. She was holding me on her lap while I blew out the candles. She walked me to school every day for 3 years because Mum and Dad both worked early shifts. She made my lunches and helped me with my homework and read me stories before bed. And someone cut her out of the only photo that documented any of that. I hadn't expected Tyler to speak up. I hadn't expected him to take my side so publicly, so completely. But something had shifted in him since our phone call. And for the first time in our lives, my little brother was standing up for me. Other family members began examining the album more closely now, passing it around, pointing to missing sections, recognizing the deliberate nature of the destruction. Aunt Jenny found the page from her own son's wedding, where a photo of me and her had been carefully removed. Uncle Robert discovered that every Christmas photo, including me, had become cut out while the same photos without me remained intact. The evidence was overwhelming, and no amount of deflection from Rachel could explain it away. This is ridiculous, Rachel said, her voice rising with barely controlled panic. I didn't do this. Why would I do something like this? Dana is just trying to make me look bad in front of everyone. She's always been jealous of me ever since we were kids. I didn't argue with her. I didn't need to. The album spoke for itself, and the people in that room could see the truth with their own eyes. Some looked at Rachel with new suspicion. Others looked at me with something I hadn't seen from my family in years, sympathy mixed with dawning understanding. The narrative Rachel had constructed, the story of the difficult older sister who was too cold and distant to bother with family, was crumbling before her eyes. My mother finally found her voice. Dana, she said slowly, where exactly did you find this? In Rachel's apartment, I repeated, in a trash bag by the door. She told me to take it to the dumpster, along with some other things she was throwing away. I kept it because something felt wrong, but I didn't understand how wrong until much later. Before my mother could respond, the front door opened and a cold gust of winter air swept through the room. Matthew walked in brushing snow from his coat, clearly expecting the warm welcome he usually received. He was carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the smile of a man who believed his life was perfect. Then, his eyes landed on the album in Tyler's hands and his smile vanished. I watched his face as he recognized what he was seeing. The Cape Cod photos that Rachel swore didn't exist. The evidence of a relationship she claimed was a delusion invented by her unstable sister. His expression cycled through confusion, then recognition, then something darker as the pieces began falling into place. "What is that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where did that come from?" Rachel started toward him, her hands outstretched. "Matthew, honey, let me explain. This isn't what it looks like. Dana is trying to cause trouble. She brought this to upset everyone. You know how she is." But Matthew wasn't looking at Rachel. He was looking at the album, at the torn pages, and the deliberate cuts at the systematic erasure of the woman who had once been the most important person in his life. And in that moment, I saw the first crack appear in the foundation of lies my sister had built. Matthew stood frozen in the doorway, the bottle of wine still clutched in his hand like he had forgotten it existed. His eyes were locked on the album, on the torn pages, on the scattered evidence of a history Rachel had convinced him never happened. I watched the colour drain from his face as recognition set in, as the implications of what he was seeing began to register. He moved forward slowly, setting the wine on a side table without looking, his attention entirely focused on the photographs. Tyler held the album out to him, and Matthew took it with trembling hands. He turned pages carefully, examining each torn section, each deliberate cut. When he reached the Cape Cod photos, the ones I had labelled on the gift box, he stopped breathing entirely. One photograph remained partially intact, a corner that had escaped whoever had tried to destroy it. It showed Matthew's hand intertwined with mine, our fingers laced together in the easy intimacy of people deeply in love. The image was unmistakable, the setting, clearly the beach house where we had celebrated our anniversary. The date was visible in the corner, written in my handwriting, on the photo border, the way I always documented our memories together. Matthew looked up at Rachel, and I saw something shatter in his expression. "You said this never happened," he said, his voice hollow. "When I found that photo online years ago, you said Dana had photoshopped it. You said she was so obsessed with me that she fabricated evidence of a relationship that didn't exist. You said your whole family was worried about her mental state." Rachel's face contorted, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking under pressure. "Matthew, honey, you don't understand. She is obsessed. She's been trying to break us up for years. This is exactly what she wants to make you doubt me, to turn you against your own wife." Matthew shook his head slowly, still staring at the photograph. "I asked you so many times," he continued, as if Rachel hadn't spoken. "I asked why Dana never came to family events. I asked why she looked at me like I was a stranger whenever I saw her. I asked why your mother acted like Dana was some kind of dangerous person who might explode at any moment. And every single time you cried and accused me of not trusting you. You made me feel guilty for even wondering." The room was silent now, every family member watching this confrontation unfold. I could see them processing, re-evaluating, reconsidering everything they thought they knew. The difficult sister, the obsessive ex-colleague, the woman who was too unstable to be around family. All of it was being re-examined in light of Matthew's revelations. I stepped forward, keeping my voice calm and measured. "Matthew," I said gently, "what exactly did Rachel tell you about me?" He looked at me, then really looked at me, perhaps for the first time since he married my sister. His eyes were filled with confusion and dawning horror, the expression of a man watching his entire worldview collapse. "She said you were unstable," he began slowly. "She said that when I stopped returning your calls all those years ago, you became obsessed with getting me back. She said you threatened to hurt yourself if anyone contacted you about me. She said your family had to protect me from you, that any attempt to reach out would trigger a breakdown. I believed her, Dinah. I believed all of it because she seemed so scared for you, so worried about your well-being. She cried every time she talked about it." I let his words sink in before responding. "I never threatened to hurt myself," I said simply. "I never sent you a breakup message. And I never received any of your attempts to contact me after you disappeared. I spent a year wondering what I did wrong, replaying every conversation we ever had, trying to figure out how I drove away the man I loved. Meanwhile, Rachel was watching both of us suffer from a lie she created." "That's not true," Rachel shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. "She's lying. She's always been jealous of me ever since we were kids. She couldn't stand that Matthew chose me over her. This is all part of her sick fantasy." Matthew turned to face his wife, and there was no warmth left in his expression. "How did you even meet me? Rachel, tell me again. Tell everyone in this room how we got together." Rachel hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape route. "We met at a coffee shop," she said quickly. "After you left your old job." "It was a coincidence." "A coincidence?" Matthew repeated flatly. "That's what you always said. But Dana introduced me to your family at Thanksgiving, a year before I supposedly met you by chance. She brought me here to this house. I sat at that table and had dinner with your parents and your brother and you. And then, a few months later, I got a text from Dana saying she wanted to break up, and I never heard from her again, until I somehow ran into you at a coffee shop." Rachel's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. I watched the realization spread across Matthew's face, like sunrise breaking over a dark horizon. "You knew exactly who I was when you approached me," he said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "You knew I was Dana's boyfriend. You knew because you had met me at Thanksgiving. And somehow, right after Dana broke things off with me there, you were ready to comfort me, ready to tell me what a difficult person your sister was, ready to start a relationship with the man she had just dumped." "It wasn't like that," Rachel said weakly. "I was trying to help you move on. Dana had hurt you, and I was just being kind." "But Dana didn't hurt me, did she?" Matthew's voice rose now, anger finally breaking through the shock. "Dana didn't send that message. Dana didn't know anything about it. Someone else sent it from her phone, and I'm starting to understand exactly who that someone was." Rachel turned to our mother, her eyes wild with panic. "Mum, say something. Tell them Dana is lying. Tell them how she's always been dramatic and jealous and difficult. You know the truth. Tell them." But our mother just stood there pale and silent, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Her silence was its own kind of confession, and Rachel's expression shifted from panic to betrayal as she realized her last ally had abandoned her. "This is ridiculous," Rachel screamed, her composure completely shattered now. "Dana is manipulating all of you. She's been planning this for years, waiting for the perfect moment to destroy my marriage and my family. She's sick. She needs help. Why can't anyone see what she's doing?" I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I had transferred the audio file from my old device, had it queued up and ready for this exact moment. "If I'm lying," I said calmly, "then explain this. Explain your own voice." I pressed play, and Rachel's laughter filled the room, bright and cruel and unmistakably hers. "Oh my God, it was so easy," the recording began. "I just sent him a text from her phone and deleted it. She has no idea. Neither does he." Rachel's face went white as her own words echoed through the silent room, condemning her more completely than anything I could have said. The room seemed to shrink as Rachel's voice continued pouring from my phone speaker. Every word hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore, impossible to explain away. I watched faces change as the recording played, watched disbelief transform into understanding, watched years of carefully constructed lies crumble in real time. I just wanted to see how it felt to take something she loved. Rachel's recorded voice continued casual and amused, as if she were discussing a game rather than the deliberate destruction of her sister's life. She always got praised, always got attention. Perfect Dana, with her perfect grades and her perfect job. Everyone always talking about how smart she was, how successful, how proud they were. No one ever looked at me that way. So when I saw Matthew at Thanksgiving, when I saw how he looked at her, I thought it was my turn. Just once I wanted to take something that was hers. Megan's voice came through next, tinny but recognisable, asking Rachel how she had done it. And Rachel answered eagerly, proud of her own cleverness, describing the plan in detail. The borrowed phone, the carefully worded breakup text, the deleted notification, the lies, whilst she told Matthew about Dana's mental instability. She walked through each step like a chef explaining a recipe, completely unaware that her words were being preserved. "The best part is she'll never know," Rachel's voice said, laughing. "She'll spend the rest of her life thinking Matthew just got tired of her and left. And Matthew will spend the rest of his life thinking Dana is crazy. They'll never talk to each other. They'll never figure it out. And I get everything." My mother rose from her chair, her face streaked with tears, her hand reaching toward my phone. "Dana, please," she said, her voice breaking. "Turn it off. This is enough. We don't need to hear any more." I looked at her calmly, keeping my phone out of reach. "You've chosen silence for years," I said. "You watched Rachel destroy my relationship and said nothing. You found evidence that she destroyed my career and covered it up. You let her rewrite history while I was painted as the villain. For once in my life, let me speak. Let everyone hear the truth." My mother sank back into her chair, her face crumpling. She didn't try to stop me again. The recording continued, Rachel describing how she positioned herself to comfort Matthew after the breakup she had engineered. How she casually mentioned running into him at a coffee shop, pretending the meeting was coincidence. How she fed him stories about Dana's instability, her obsessive behaviour, the family's concern for his safety. She explained how she cried whenever Matthew questioned her, how she made him feel guilty for doubting, how she slowly convinced him that everything Dana might say was the product of a disturbed mind. By the time I was done, Rachel's voice said smugly, "He believed everything? He actually thinks Dana is dangerous. He actually believes she might hurt herself if he tries to contact her. I made him afraid of her, and now he'll never look back." The recording ended and silence filled the room like floodwater. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the children in the other room had gone quiet, as if the weight of what had just been revealed extended beyond the walls of the living room. Rachel's face was grey, her eyes darting around the room, searching for allies, finding none. "That's fake," she said, her voice high and thin. "She edited it. She hired someone to fake my voice. This is exactly what I've been telling you. She's obsessed. She's been planning this for years." "Megan's voice is on that recording too," I said calmly. "Your former best friend, the woman you had a falling out with 3 years ago. She sent me this file after you two stopped speaking. Would you like me to call her right now and let her confirm that this conversation happened?" Rachel's denials became increasingly frantic, her words tumbling over each other in desperate confusion. "You don't understand," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I was young. I was stupid. I didn't know what I was doing. It was just supposed to be a joke. I never meant for it to go this far." "A joke," Matthew repeated, his voice flat and dangerous. "Destroying your sister's relationship was a joke. Lying to me for 8 years was a joke. Building our entire marriage on manipulation and deception was a joke." Rachel reached for him, but he stepped back as if her touch would burn. "Matthew, please," she begged. "I love you. Everything we've built together, our life, our baby, that's all real. What I did to Dana was wrong, but what we have is real." Matthew stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he slowly reached down and removed his wedding ring. The metal caught the light as he placed it carefully on the table next to the ruined family album. "Nothing about us is real," he said quietly. "I don't even know who you are." Rachel let out a sound that was half scream, half sob. She turned desperately to our mother, who had been sitting motionless throughout the recording, tears streaming silently down her face. "Mum," Rachel cried, her voice breaking, "say something. Defend me. Tell them I'm not the monster they think I am. Tell them Dana provoked me, that she deserved it somehow. Please, Mum, you've always protected me. Protect me now." The room held its breath as our mother slowly raised her head. Her eyes were red, her face aged 10 years in the span of an hour. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silence every word carried clearly. "I can't," she said. "I can't defend you anymore, Rachel. I've known. I've always known." Rachel stared at her in disbelief, betrayal flooding her features. "What do you mean? You've always known?" Our mother's tears fell faster now, her carefully maintained facade finally crumbling completely. "I found the draft of the email you sent to Dana's company," she continued, her voice shaking. "I found messages on your phone years ago that made me suspect what you did to her relationship. I knew you were lying, and I said nothing. I protected you because protecting you was easier than facing what you had become." She looked at me, then really looked at me, and I saw decades of guilt and shame in her eyes. "I sacrificed one daughter to save the other," she whispered, "and I've hated myself for it every single day." The extended family filtered out slowly after the recording ended, making awkward excuses about needing to get home, about children who were tired, about long drives ahead. No one knew what to say. No one wanted to be present for whatever came next. Aunt Jenny squeezed my hand before she left and whispered that she was proud of me, that she had always known something was wrong with how I was treated. Her kindness almost broke me more than the confrontation had. Within an hour, only immediate family remained in the living room. My father sat in his armchair looking older than I had ever seen him, his silence a wall he had built around himself. Tyler stood by the window, arms crossed, watching everything with the expression of someone who had finally chosen a side. Matthew had retreated to a corner, his face blank with shock, still processing the collapse of everything he thought he knew. Rachel sat crumpled on the couch, mascara streaking her cheeks, alternating between quiet sobs and bursts of defensive anger. And my mother remained in her chair, hands folded in her lap, tears still falling as she stared at nothing. I should have said something years ago. My mother finally spoke, her voice hollow and distant. When I found that email draft on Rachel's computer, I should have confronted her. I should have told you, Dana. I should have done so many things differently. Rachel's head snapped up. Mom, please, she started, but our mother raised a hand to silence her. No more, she said firmly. No more lies. No more protecting you from consequences you created yourself. It's time I told the truth. All of it. She took a shaky breath and looked at me with eyes that held decades of buried pain. When I was 18 years old, she began, I received a full scholarship to study literature at a university abroad. It was everything I had ever dreamed of. I was going to be a writer, a professor, someone who mattered beyond the borders of this small town. My teachers said I had talent. My counselors said I had potential. For the first time in my life, I believed I could become something extraordinary. She paused, her hands twisting in her lap. But my parents refused to let me go. They said it was too far, too dangerous, too impractical. They said a woman's place was with her family, that education beyond high school was a waste of time for a girl who would just end up married with children anyway. They introduced me to your father at a church social and made it clear that refusing his attention would be seen as ungrateful and shameful. I was engaged within 6 months, married within a year, pregnant with you within 2. I had never heard any of this before. My mother never talked about her youth, her dreams, her life before us. I always assumed she had simply wanted what she had: a home, a husband, children. It never occurred to me that she might have wanted something else entirely. I gave up everything, she continued, her voice cracking. I gave up my scholarship, my dreams, my chance to become the person I was supposed to be. And for years, I told myself it was worth it. I had a family, I had stability, I had everything a woman was supposed to want. But deep down, there was always this rage, this grief, this sense of having been robbed of a life I never got to live. She looked at me then, and I saw the truth written across her face before she even said the words. And then you came along, Dana, my firstborn daughter. Brilliant, driven, independent. You had every opportunity I was denied, and you grabbed them with both hands. You earned scholarships like the one I lost. You built a career like the one I dreamed of. You became successful, respected, free. Everything I should have celebrated, everything a mother should be proud of. Her voice dropped to a whisper. But I wasn't proud. I was jealous. I watched you become everything I was never allowed to be. And instead of joy, I felt resentment. Every achievement of yours felt like a reminder of my own failure. Every success was a mirror showing me the life I could have had. I hated myself for feeling that way, but I couldn't stop. The room was utterly silent. Even Rachel had stopped crying, her eyes wide as she listened to revelations she had clearly never heard before. When Rachel started undermining you, my mother continued, I should have stopped her. I should have protected you. But part of me, a part I'm deeply ashamed of, felt vindicated. Watching you struggle, watching you lose things, watching you become less perfect made me feel less like a failure. I let Rachel hurt you because your pain made my own easier to bear. She broke down completely, then sobbing into her hands, years of guilt finally pouring out. I sacrificed you on the altar of my own unhealed wounds, she choked out. I chose to protect the daughter who enabled my worst impulses, instead of the daughter who reminded me of everything I lost. And I hate myself for it, Dana. I have hated myself for it every single day. I stood there listening, feeling something crack open inside me. All my life, I had wondered why my mother treated me the way she did. I had searched for explanations, had tried to identify what I had done wrong, had twisted myself into knots trying to earn affection that never came. And now I understood. It was never about anything I did. It was about who I was. My very existence was the trigger for her deepest pain. I should have felt vindicated. I should have felt triumphant, finally having the explanation I had sought for 36 years. But instead, I felt something unexpected. I felt sorry for her. I felt sorry for the 18-year-old girl who lost her dreams, who was forced into a life she didn't choose, who spent decades burying her grief until it poisoned everything around her. But feeling sorry for her didn't erase what she had done. Understanding didn't equal forgiveness. Knowing why she hurt me didn't make the hurt disappear. I walked over to where she sat and knelt down so we were eye level. Tears were streaming down my own face, now tears I couldn't have stopped even if I wanted to. "Did you ever consider," I asked softly, my voice steady despite the emotion behind it, "that you could have been proud of me instead of threatened by me? That watching me succeed could have felt like victory instead of loss, that my achievements could have been your achievements too, because you raised me, because your sacrifices made my freedom possible." My mother looked at me, her face crumpled with grief and shame. "Did it ever occur to you," I continued, "that we could have healed together instead of hurting each other? That I would have given anything to have a mother who celebrated me instead of resented me?" She had no answer. There was no answer that could undo 36 years of damage. And in the silence, I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something close to understanding. And maybe, just maybe, the first fragile possibility of healing. The house grew quiet as the night deepened. My father had retreated to bed without saying a word, his silence, a fortress he had built over decades of avoiding conflict. Tyler left to drive Matthew to a hotel, both of them too shell-shocked to make decisions beyond putting one foot in front of the other. Rachel had locked herself in her childhood bedroom, her muffled sobs occasionally breaking through the walls. And I sat in the kitchen with my mother, 2 cups of untouched tea growing cold between us. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. The clock on the wall ticked away the minutes. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white silence. It felt strange to be sitting here in the room, where I had eaten breakfast as a child, where I had done homework at this very table, where I had learned to become invisible so that the people around me could feel more comfortable. "Your father was never cruel," my mother finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But he was never present either. He married me because his parents approved. He provided for us because that's what men were supposed to do. But my opinions, my dreams, my desires, those were inconveniences to him. He learned early that if he just ignored what I wanted long enough, I would eventually stop wanting it." I listened without interrupting, understanding that she needed to tell this story, needed someone to finally hear the truth she had buried for so long. My own mother was the same way, she continued. She gave up her chance at education to marry young. Her mother did too. Generation after generation of women taught that our purpose was to serve, to sacrifice, to shrink ourselves small enough to fit into the spaces men allowed us. We were told that capable women were threatening that ambition, in a woman was unattractive, that the best thing we could do was make ourselves useful without being noticed. She looked at me with eyes that held decades of suppressed pain. "When I saw you refuse to shrink," she said, "I was terrified. Terrified for you because I knew how the world punished women who took up space, and terrified of you because you were living proof that everything I had been taught was a lie. You showed me that women could be brilliant and successful and independent, that we didn't have to sacrifice ourselves on the altar of family duty. And instead of celebrating you, I resented you for having the courage I never found. I wrapped my hands around my cold cup of tea, feeling the ceramic against my palms. I understood what she was telling me. I could trace the chain of inherited trauma, see how it wound through generations, how each woman passed her wounds to the next like a terrible inheritance. My grandmother had been diminished, so she diminished my mother. My mother had been diminished, so she diminished me. The cycle was as old as time and as destructive as any natural disaster. But understanding didn't erase the damage. I hear what you're saying, I told her carefully. I can see how your own pain shaped the choices you made. And I'm grateful that you're finally being honest with me, that you're showing me the person behind the mother who hurt me. It helps me see you as human, not just as someone who failed me. She looked up at me with desperate hope in her eyes. But I continued gently. Understanding why you hurt me doesn't erase that you hurt me. You stood by while Rachel destroyed my relationship. You covered up evidence that she destroyed my career. You let me be blamed and shunned and excluded for crimes I never committed. For 36 years, I wondered what was wrong with me, why my own mother couldn't love me the way she loved Rachel. Now I know it was never about me at all. I was just a mirror reflecting back everything you couldn't face about yourself. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry, Dana. I know you are. I can see that you mean it. But sorry doesn't undo 3 decades of damage. Sorry doesn't give me back the relationship Rachel stole, or the career she sabotaged, or the years I spent thinking I was fundamentally unlovable. Then what can I do? Her voice cracked with desperation. How can I make this right? I'll do anything, Dana, whatever it takes. Just tell me how to fix this. I considered her question carefully. Part of me wanted to give her a simple answer, a clear path to redemption that would make everything better. But life didn't work that way. Healing didn't work that way. Forgiveness isn't a gift I give instantly, I said finally. It's not something I can hand over just because you asked nicely, or because you cried, or because you finally told me the truth. Forgiveness is a process. It takes time, and it requires you to actually change. Not just feel sorry. Feeling sorry is easy. It costs nothing. Change is hard. Change requires you to do the difficult work of becoming a different person than the one who hurt me. She nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. What would that look like? Changing. I thought about it before answering. It means standing up for me even when it's uncomfortable. It means refusing to let Rachel rewrite history ever again. It means treating me like a daughter you're proud of, not a threat you need to manage. It means being honest even when honesty is painful. It means choosing the hard right over the easy wrong consistently for the rest of our lives. Not because you owe me, but because it's the right thing to do. My mother reached across the table and took my hand. Her fingers were cold, trembling. I want to try, she said. I know I've given you no reason to believe me. I know I've failed you in every way a mother can fail. But I want to try to become someone worthy of your forgiveness, even if it takes the rest of my life. I squeezed her hand gently. That's all I can ask, I said. And it's more than you've ever offered before. So let's start there. Let's start with trying. For a moment, sitting in that quiet kitchen, with snow falling outside, I felt something I hadn't felt with my mother in decades. Not forgiveness, not yet, but hope. The smallest flicker of hope that maybe after all these years, something could actually change. Then footsteps sounded in the hallway, sharp and angry against the hardwood floor. Rachel appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face swollen from crying, her eyes wild with a desperation I had never seen before. She looked from me to our mother, taking in our joined hands the intimacy of the conversation she had clearly been eavesdropping on. So now you're choosing her? Rachel's voice was ragged, stripped of all the sweetness she usually deployed. After everything I've done for this family, after all the years I spent making you feel needed and important and loved, you're choosing. Dana Rachel stood in the doorway like a wounded animal backed into a corner, all pretense stripped away. The polished sister who always knew exactly what to say, who could charm any room and manipulate any situation, had vanished. In her place was someone raw and desperate, years of hidden resentment finally clawing its way to the surface. "You want to know why I did it?" Rachel's voice rose, trembling with fury. "Because you never had to try. Everything came so easily to you. The grades, the scholarships, the career. You just floated through life being perfect, while the rest of us scrambled for scraps of attention. Do you have any idea what it's like to grow up in the shadow of someone who makes you feel worthless just by existing?" I stayed seated, letting her words wash over me without flinching. "You were always so cold," she continued, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "So above it all, you never needed anyone. You never struggled. You just looked down at the rest of us from your perfect little tower and judged. Mum was right to resent you. Everyone was right. You made us all feel inadequate without even trying." I thought about all the years I had spent alone, wondering what was wrong with me, wondering why my family treated me like an outsider. I thought about the birthdays forgotten, the achievements dismissed, the constant message that I was somehow too much and not enough at the same time. Rachel saw coldness where there had only been self-protection. She saw arrogance where there had only been survival. "Everything you think you know about me," I said calmly, "you invented to justify what you did. I wasn't cold. I was lonely. I wasn't above it all. I was excluded from it all. You saw what you needed to see so you could feel good about destroying me." Rachel laughed bitterly. "Destroying you? Look at you. You have this amazing career and this perfect apartment in Seattle. You have money and success and freedom. I didn't destroy anything. You're fine." I stood up slowly, facing my sister across the kitchen. "I have a career because I poured everything into my work when I had nothing else. I have money because I saved every penny since I never knew when my family would abandon me again. I have freedom because I learnt early that depending on anyone in this family was a mistake. Everything I have, I built alone from the rubble of what you took from me. So don't tell me I'm fine, Rachel. Don't pretend you did me a favour." Rachel's face twisted. "You want to talk about what I took? You took Matthew first. You brought him here, showed him off like a trophy. You didn't think about how that made me feel watching my perfect sister with her perfect boyfriend while I had nothing." I took a breath before responding. "I brought someone I loved home to meet my family. That's what normal people do, Rachel. It's not a crime. It's not an attack on you. The fact that you saw it that way says everything about who you are." Before Rachel could respond, footsteps sounded behind her. Matthew appeared in the hallway, still wearing the clothes he had arrived in hours earlier. He looked exhausted, hollowed out, a man who had just watched his entire life revealed as a fiction. "Matthew," Rachel said, turning to him with sudden desperation, "tell them they're wrong. Tell them our marriage is real. Tell them you love me, that what we have matters more than whatever Dana has been scheming." Matthew walked past her into the kitchen, not meeting her eyes. He stood near the counter, arms crossed, staring at the floor. "I spent 8 years with someone I didn't know," he said quietly. His voice was hollow, drained of all emotion. "Every time I wondered about Dana, every time I asked a question, you cried. You made me feel guilty for even thinking about the past. You told me I was hurting you by not trusting you completely. And I believed you. I let you convince me that my own curiosity was a betrayal." Rachel reached for him. "That wasn't manipulation. I was scared of losing you. I loved you so much that the thought of Dana taking you back terrified me." Matthew finally looked at her, and there was nothing left in his eyes. No anger, no love, nothing but exhaustion. "That's not love, Rachel. That's captivity. You kept me imprisoned in a version of reality you created. You made me afraid to ask questions, afraid to trust my own instincts. Every time I felt something was wrong, you made me doubt myself until I stopped feeling anything at all." Rachel's hand flew to her pregnant belly, her final card to play. "What about our baby? You can't do this to our baby. The stress you're putting me through right now could hurt the pregnancy. Is that what you want? To harm your own child because you're angry with me. I watched Matthew's face, waiting to see if this manipulation would work the way all her others had. He shook his head slowly. I will be a father to our child. That baby is innocent in all of this, and I will love them and support them and be present for every moment of their life. But I can't be your husband anymore, Rachel. I can't stay married to someone I don't know, someone who built our entire relationship on lies. Our child deserves better than parents who are trapped in a fake marriage. Rachel's face contorted with rage. She spun back toward me, her eyes wild. You think you've won? She screamed. Look at yourself. You're 36 years old with no husband, no children, no family. I still have more than you'll ever have. I still have a baby coming. I still have a home. I still have people who love me. What do you have, Dana? What did all your precious success actually get you? I met her gaze without flinching. Everything I have, I said quietly, I built with my own hands. My career, my savings, my self-respect. I earned every single thing in my life without lying, without manipulating, without destroying anyone else. Can you say the same, Rachel? Can you point to one single thing you have that you didn't steal or lie to get? Rachel stared at me, her mouth opening and closing, searching for words that wouldn't come. And, in her silence, I finally had my answer. I didn't sleep that night. After Rachel retreated to her room and Matthew left for his hotel, I sat in the living room watching the snow fall through the window, my mind too full for rest. The house settled around me, creaking and sighing like an old man easing into sleep. By the time dawn broke grey and cold over the Ohio landscape, I had made peace with the fact that this Christmas would be unlike any other. My father was the first one downstairs. He moved slowly, age showing in every step, and startled slightly when he saw me curled up on the couch. For a long moment, he just stood there looking at me, his face unreadable. Then, he walked into the kitchen, and I heard him making coffee with the practiced movements of a man who had performed the same ritual for decades. When he returned, he carried 2 cups. He handed one to me, and sat down heavily in his armchair, the same chair he had occupied for as long as I could remember. We drank in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the ticking clock and the distant hum of the heater. I know about the house, he finally said. I looked at him waiting. The bank sent a letter. He continued staring into his coffee cup rather than meeting my eyes. A thank you for full payment. It was supposed to go to the law firm you used, but someone addressed it wrong and it came here instead. Your mother never saw it. I found it in the mail and hid it before she could ask questions. He took a long sip of his coffee. I traced the company back to you. It took some time, but I figured it out. And then I did the math and realised my eldest daughter had paid off $150,000 of our debt without ever saying a word, without ever expecting anything in return. His voice cracked on the last words. I wanted to say something then. I wanted to ask why he never mentioned it, why he kept this knowledge to himself for 2 years, while I continued to be treated like an afterthought. But I stayed silent, sensing he had more to say. I saw everything, Dana. My father's voice was barely above a whisper now. Your whole life I saw how your mother treated you. I saw how Rachel manipulated and schemed and lied. I saw you being pushed aside and blamed and erased from this family. And I said nothing. I did nothing, because confronting your mother standing up to Rachel, that would have made my life difficult. And I was too much of a coward to accept that difficulty. He finally looked at me, and I saw tears in his eyes for the first time I could remember. I let you become the family scapegoat because it was easier than fighting for you. I told myself you were strong, that you didn't need my protection, that you would be fine on your own. But that was just an excuse. The truth is, I failed you. I failed you as a father in every way that matters. I set down my coffee cup and went to him, kneeling beside his chair the way I had, as a little girl. He reached out and took my hand, his grip trembling. I'm sorry, he said. I know it's not enough. I know words can't undo a lifetime of neglect. But I'm sorry, Dana. I'm so sorry. I squeezed his hand but said nothing. What could I say? His apology was decades late. His regret, however genuine, couldn't give me back the father I had needed as a child. But I appreciated that he was finally saying the words, finally acknowledging what he had allowed to happen. Tyler came downstairs next, followed shortly by our mother. The atmosphere was heavy, everyone moving carefully around each other like strangers sharing a waiting room. We gathered in the living room, the Christmas tree standing incongruously cheerful. In the corner, its lights blinking as if nothing had changed. There's more, Tyler said, breaking the thick silence. Things Dana did that none of you know about. He looked at me, asking silent permission. I nodded slightly. She paid for my entire college education, Tyler announced. 4 years of tuition, books, housing. I thought it was some scholarship I never applied for. It was Dana. She paid for everything and never said a word. My mother's face went pale. Tyler continued, the church charity you're always bragging about contributing to Mom Dana is the anonymous donor who funded most of it. The medical bills for Cousin Sarah's surgery 3 years ago, Dana covered them. The down payment that helped Uncle Robert keep his business afloat, Dana. He turned to face our parents fully. While you were treating her like a burden, while Rachel was actively destroying her life, Dana was quietly holding this entire family together. She was saving your house and funding your charities and helping relatives you've never even mentioned her to. She was being the family's invisible foundation, while you all stood on top of her and pretended she didn't exist. The room fell silent. I watched my parents process this information, watched the weight of their failures settle more heavily on their shoulders. Aunt Jenny had arrived early that morning, wanting to check on the family after the dramatic events of Christmas Eve. She had been there standing in the doorway, listening to Tyler's revelations. Now she stepped forward, her expression troubled. There's something else, she said quietly. Something I've been trying to understand for months. Everyone turned to look at her. I work in finance, she continued. After Matthew's company was saved by that mysterious investor 4 years ago, I got curious. I did some digging. It took a long time, but last month I finally traced the investment back to its source. She looked directly at me. Dana, she said softly, why would you save the company of the man who broke your heart? Why would you invest $200,000 to rescue your sister's husband? Every eye in the room turned to me, waiting for an answer to Aunt Jenny's question. The silence stretched as I gathered my thoughts, trying to find words that could explain something I had barely been able to explain to myself. I didn't do it for Matthew, I said finally. And I didn't do it for Rachel either. Then why? Aunt Jenny pressed gently. $200,000 is not a small amount. That's years of savings for most people. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered yard where I had played as a child back when I still believed my family loved me the same way I loved them. 4 years ago, Tyler called me worried about Mum and Dad. Matthew's company was failing and Rachel was already making noise about moving back home if things didn't improve. If Matthew went bankrupt, Rachel would have left him. She would have come back here with nothing, expecting our parents to support her. And Mum and Dad would have done it. They would have drained their retirement mortgage this house again, destroyed themselves financially, to rescue Rachel from the consequences of her own choices. I turned back to face the room. I didn't save Matthew's company to help Matthew. I saved it to prevent a cascade of disasters that would have hurt everyone, including the parents who never protected me, and the sister who actively destroyed me. Because that's who I am. I do the right thing, even when the people I'm helping don't deserve it, even when no one will ever know, even when it costs me more than I can afford. But how could you? My mother asked, her voice barely audible. After everything we did to you, I considered her question carefully before answering. My worth isn't measured by whether people acknowledge what I do, I said. I spent years trying to earn your love, trying to prove I was good enough, waiting for recognition that never came. And at some point, I realized I was asking the wrong question. The question isn't whether other people see my value. The question is whether I know my own value, regardless of what anyone else thinks. I walked back to the couch and sat down, feeling the weight of exhaustion settling into my bones. I did the right things because they were right, not because I expected medals or thank yous or love. I helped this family because I could, because the opportunity was there, because walking away would have made me someone I didn't want to be. My integrity isn't dependent on your approval. It never was. The room was quiet as everyone absorbed my words. I saw something shift in my father's expression, a kind of painful awakening. My mother was crying silently, her shoulders shaking. Even Tyler looked at me with new understanding, as if seeing me clearly for the first time. Matthew had been standing in the doorway, having returned at some point during the conversation. He stepped forward now, his face drawn with guilt and regret. "Dana," he said quietly, "can we talk?" Just the two of us. I studied him for a moment. This man I had once loved more than anything. This man who had been stolen from me through lies and manipulation. Part of me wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain the walls I had built around my heart. But another part recognized that we both needed closure, needed to finally have the conversation that should have happened 10 years ago. I nodded and stood up. We walked outside to the back porch where the cold air hit my face like a wake-up call. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the world blanketed in pristine white. "I don't know where to start," Matthew said, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "I've spent the last 12 hours replaying every moment of the past decade, trying to understand how I could have been so blind. Rachel is very good at what she does," I said neutrally. "She's been manipulating people her entire life. You're not the first person she fooled, and you won't be the last." He shook his head. "That's not an excuse. I should have questioned her stories. I should have tried to reach you even when she said it would be dangerous. Deep down, something always felt wrong about the way you supposedly ended things. But every time I started to doubt, Rachel would cry or panic or make me feel guilty for not trusting her. And I let her. I chose comfort over truth. I leaned against the porch railing, looking out at the frozen landscape. "You made choices based on lies," I said. "I don't blame you for being deceived." Rachel constructed a very convincing narrative, and she had my own family backing her up. From your perspective, you had no reason to doubt what you were being told. But I should have had reason. Matthew's voice cracked. The Dana I knew would never have sent that breakup text. The Dana I loved would never have just disappeared without an explanation. I knew you. I should have trusted that knowledge instead of accepting a story that didn't fit. I turned to face him. Maybe. Or maybe you wanted to believe it because believing it was easier than fighting for the truth. Either way, it doesn't matter now. What we had is gone. Matthew. 10 years have passed, we're different people. Even if Rachel hadn't lied, even if we had stayed together, we wouldn't be the same couple we were back then. Is there no chance he asked the question like a man who already knew the answer but needed to hear it spoken aloud? "No," I said gently. "I don't hate you. I don't even blame you anymore. But I can't rebuild something that was destroyed so completely. The foundation is gone. There's nothing left to build on." He nodded slowly, accepting my words with the resignation of someone who had expected nothing else. "I'm sorry, Dana, for everything. For not fighting harder, for not questioning more, for letting you become a villain in a story where you were actually the victim." "I know," I said. "And I accept your apology. But acceptance isn't the same as restoration. Some things can be forgiven without being repaired." We stood in silence for a moment, two people who had once meant everything to each other, now separated by a decade of lies and lost time. Then I turned and walked back inside, leaving Matthew alone with his regrets. I was gathering my things, preparing to return to Seattle when Tyler caught my arm. "Wait," he said urgently. "There's one more thing you should know. Rachel isn't done. I heard her on the phone this morning talking to someone. She was making plans. I don't know what exactly, but Dana, she sounded desperate. And desperate people do dangerous things." I returned to Seattle the day after Christmas, leaving behind a family that would never be the same. The flight felt longer than usual, each passing mile, putting distance between me and the chaos I had unleashed. Part of me felt lighter, unburdened by secrets I had carried for a decade. Another part felt the heavy exhaustion that comes after a battle, even one that ends in victory. For the first week, I threw myself back into work, grateful for the normalcy of deadlines and meetings and problems that had clear solutions. My colleagues noticed I seemed different, more present, somehow less guarded. I didn't explain. Some changes are too big to summarize in casual office conversation. Then the email arrived. It came from our HR department marked urgent, requesting my immediate presence in a meeting room on the executive floor. My stomach tightened as I read the formal language, the careful phrasing that suggested something serious. I had been through this before. I knew what it felt like to be blindsided by accusations that came from nowhere and destroyed everything. The HR director was waiting for me, along with 2 members of the legal team. They explained that they had received an anonymous complaint alleging financial fraud and professional misconduct. The accusations were serious enough to require investigation. They showed me a printout of the email, and as I read the words, cold recognition washed over me. The writing style was unmistakable. The specific accusations vague enough to be difficult to disprove, but serious enough to demand action. The method of anonymous submission designed to protect the accuser while exposing the target. I had seen this exact playbook before 6 years ago, when it cost me my previous job. Rachel, I took a deep breath and asked if I could share some context that might be relevant to their investigation. The HR director nodded, and I began to explain. I told them about my sister, about the documented history of sabotage, about the recording I had played for my family just a week earlier. I offered to provide copies of everything: the audio file, the confession, the evidence of a pattern of harassment spanning years. I also suggested they trace the IP address of the anonymous email confidant of what they would find. The investigation took 3 days. During that time, I continued working as a normal, refusing to let Rachel's attack derail my life again. I had spent too many years wondering what I did wrong, accepting blame for crimes I didn't commit. This time would be different. The results came back exactly as I expected. The anonymous email had been sent from an IP address registered to my parents' home in Ohio. The timing corresponded with Rachel's stay there after Christmas. The accusations contained no verifiable evidence, just vague claims designed to create suspicion. And when the company's legal team reviewed the recording I provided, they recognized it as documentation of a previous identical attack. My manager called me into her office to deliver the news personally. Not only had I been completely cleared, but the company was taking action against my accuser. Their legal team had drafted a formal cease and desist letter to be sent to Rachel, warning that any further defamatory communications would result in a lawsuit for harassment and intentional interference with business relations. The letter would inform Rachel that her anonymous email had been traced, that her pattern of behaviour had been documented, and that she was now on notice. Any future attempts to contact my employer or spread false information about me would have legal consequences. I sat in my manager's office after she finished explaining, feeling something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Just a profound sadness that my own sister had learned nothing from the confrontation at Christmas. Even after being exposed, even after watching her marriage crumble and her family turn against her, Rachel's first instinct was still to attack me. She was so committed to destroying me that she couldn't see she was only destroying herself. 2 weeks passed. I settled back into my routine, the cease and desist letter, presumably delivered the threat of legal action hanging over Rachel's head. I didn't hear from anyone in my family except Tyler, who sent occasional text messages checking on me and updating me on the situation in Ohio. Then one evening my phone rang with Tyler's number. "Matthew filed for divorce this morning," he said without preamble. His voice was tired but not surprised. He cited irreconcilable differences and fundamental breach of trust. The papers were served at the house while Rachel was having breakfast. She completely fell apart. I sat down slowly on my couch processing the news. I had expected this, had known it was coming, ever since Matthew placed his wedding ring on the table Christmas Eve. But hearing it confirmed still felt significant, the final collapse of the life Rachel had built on stolen foundations. Tyler continued. She's been calling everyone trying to get people on her side, but nobody is answering anymore. Aunt Jenny told her she needed professional help. Uncle Robert said he couldn't support someone who had done what she did. Even Mum is keeping her distance, which I never thought I'd see. Rachel is completely alone, Dana. For the first time in her life, nobody is rushing to rescue her. I asked about the baby, the innocent life caught in the middle of all this wreckage. Matthew says he'll be a present father, Tyler replied. He's already talking to lawyers about custody arrangements. He doesn't want to punish the child for Rachel's sins. But he also made it clear that being a good father doesn't mean staying in a toxic marriage. I stared out my window at the Seattle skyline, thinking about how different everything looked compared to just a month ago. Rachel had spent years systematically destroying my life, and now she was watching her own fall apart. Not because of anything I did to her, but because the truth she had worked so hard to bury had finally clawed its way into the light. She's losing everything, Tyler said quietly. The husband, the family support, the reputation she spent her whole life building. And you know what the worst part is? She still doesn't understand why. She still thinks she's the victim. The divorce proceedings moved faster than anyone expected. Matthew had hired a sharp attorney who understood that the case was about more than simple, irreconcilable differences. The pattern of deception that Rachel had woven over 8 years became central to the legal strategy each lie documented and presented as evidence of a marriage built on fraud. Tyler kept me updated through regular phone calls describing the depositions and filings with the detached tone of someone watching a car accident in slow motion. Matthew's lawyer had subpoenaed records, gathered statements, and built a case that painted Rachel not as a wronged wife, but as a calculating manipulator who had deceived her husband from the very beginning of their relationship. The recording I'd played at Christmas became a key piece of evidence. Rachel's own voice bragging about how she had stolen Matthew by sending fake messages and spreading lies about my mental health was entered into the court record. Her attorney tried to argue it was obtained illegally, but since Megan had recorded their video call and voluntarily provided it to me, the judge allowed it to stand. Megan herself became an unexpected witness. After years of silence, she finally came forward publicly, confirming not only the authenticity of the recording, but sharing additional stories of Rachel's manipulative behaviour. She described how Rachel had sabotaged other friendships, spread rumours about colleagues, and consistently lied to get what she wanted. The testimony painted a picture of someone who viewed deception, not as a last resort, but as a primary tool. Rachel's social circle collapsed almost overnight. Friends who had believed her version of events for years suddenly saw her differently. Women who had envied her perfect marriage and beautiful home now whispered about what had really been happening behind closed doors. The carefully crafted image she had spent decades building crumbled like a sandcastle in rising tide. I watched all of this unfold from a distance, feeling strangely detached. I had not orchestrated Rachel's downfall. I had simply stopped hiding what she did to me. The consequences she faced were not my revenge, but the natural result of truth finally being acknowledged. Lies can only survive in darkness. Once the light touches them, they wither. Then Rachel called me. It was late on a Tuesday evening, and I almost didn't answer when I saw the Ohio area code. But something made me pick up some instinct that told me this conversation needed to happen. Her voice was raw, stripped of all the sweetness and charm she usually deployed. She alternated between screaming and sobbing, her words tumbling over each other in incoherent bursts. "You destroyed my life," she shrieked. "Are you happy now? Everything I worked for, everything I built, you took it all away. I have nothing left because of you." I listened without interrupting, letting her rage wash over me. "I hope you're satisfied," she continued, her voice cracking. "I hope you can sleep at night, knowing you ruined your own sister. What kind of person does that? What kind of monster destroys their own family?" When she finally paused to breathe, I spoke calmly. "I didn't do this to you, Rachel. I simply stopped hiding what you did to me. For 10 years, I kept your secrets. I protected you from consequences you deserved. I watched you enjoy a life you stole while I rebuilt mine from nothing. All I did was tell the truth. Everything that's happening to you now comes from your own choices, not mine." "That's easy for you to say," she spat. "You have everything. Your fancy job, your perfect apartment, your freedom. You got to walk away from the wreckage while I'm drowning in it. I got to walk away because I never built my life on lies. I earned what I have through hard work and integrity. You could have done the same, Rachel. You had every advantage, every opportunity. But instead of building something real, you chose to steal and deceive. The foundation you built on was rotten from the start. It was always going to collapse eventually." She started crying harder, the anger giving way to something that sounded almost like despair. "Everyone hates me now. My friends won't return my calls. Mum barely speaks to me. Matthew looks at me like I'm a stranger. I'm going to lose the house, the car, everything we had together. And you just get to go back to your life like nothing happened." I took a deep breath before responding. "Do you remember what you said to me at Christmas? You told me I had nothing. No husband, no children, no family. You said you still had more than I would ever have. But look at us now, Rachel. Everything you had was built on sand. Everything I have is built on rock. The storms came, and your house fell, while mine stands." She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was smaller, younger, almost unrecognizable. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to make anyone forgive me. I've tried apologizing, but no one believes me anymore. They all think I'm just manipulating again. Maybe that's because you've spent your whole life manipulating people," I said gently. "Trust takes years to build and seconds to destroy. You can't expect to undo decades of deception with a few apologies. If you're serious about changing, it's going to take time, and there's no guarantee anyone will ever fully trust you again." Her sobs intensified, and then her voice broke through them, raw and trembling. "You don't understand, Dana. I'm pregnant. I'm completely alone. Matthew is divorcing me. Mum can barely look at me. I have no friends left. I'm going to have this baby by myself, and I don't know what to do. I don't know how to be alone. I've never been alone in my entire life." For just a moment, she didn't sound like the sister who had systematically destroyed my happiness. She sounded like a frightened child who had finally realized that her actions had consequences, and she had no idea how to face them. I didn't sleep well after Rachel's call. Her voice kept echoing in my mind, that raw vulnerability I had never heard from her before. The frightened child underneath the manipulator. Part of me wanted to feel satisfaction at her suffering, to see it as justice finally served. But another part, the part I had tried so hard to protect over the years, felt something more complicated. Not sympathy exactly, but a recognition that broken people break others, and Rachel had clearly been broken long before she started breaking me. I booked a flight to Ohio 3 days later. Not to rescue Rachel, not to offer forgiveness on a silver platter, but to have conversations that needed to happen, to set boundaries clearly and compassionately, to close chapters that had been left open for too long. My mother was surprised when I showed up at the door. She looked older than she had at Christmas, the weight of everything that had happened visible in the new lines around her eyes. We sat in the kitchen again, that same table where so many difficult conversations had taken place, and I told her why I had come. "Rachel needs help," I said directly. "Not protection, not excuses, not someone to tell her everything will be okay. She needs professional help. A therapist who can work with her on the insecurity and envy that drove her to do what she did. Someone who can help her understand why she spent her whole life trying to destroy me instead of building her own happiness." My mother nodded slowly, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup she wasn't drinking from. "I don't know how to help her," she admitted. "Every time I try to talk to her, she either screams at me or falls apart crying. She blames everyone except herself. She still thinks she's the victim in all of this. That's exactly why she needs a professional, I said. Someone trained to work with people who can't see their own patterns. You can't fix her mum, neither can I, but you can encourage her to get help, and you can stop enabling her denial. If she tries to blame me or anyone else for what's happening, don't agree with her just to keep the peace. She needs to face reality, not be shielded from it. My mother looked at me with something like respect in her eyes. When did you become so wise? I wasn't wise, I told her. I just had a lot of time alone to think about things. When you spend years wondering why your family treats you like an outsider, you learn to analyze patterns. You learn to understand people even when they hurt you. She reached across the table and took my hand. Can you ever forgive me for everything I did, for everything I failed to do? I considered her question carefully. I'm working on it, I said honestly. Forgiveness isn't a switch I can flip. It's a process, and I'm somewhere in the middle of it. I don't hate you anymore. I understand you better than I did. But there are wounds that will take time to heal, and I can't promise they'll ever disappear completely. She accepted this with a nod, tears streaming silently down her face. What I can promise, I continued, is that I won't carry hatred as a permanent burden. That would only poison my own life. But I also won't pretend everything is fine when it isn't, and I won't rush through healing just to make other people comfortable. Before I left my parents' house, I had one more conversation to complete. Matthew was staying at a hotel nearby while the divorce proceedings continued, and he agreed to meet me at a coffee shop downtown. He looked exhausted when he arrived, the stress of the past weeks carved into his features. We ordered drinks and sat in a quiet corner, two people who had once planned a future together, now just trying to find closure. I wanted to talk to you about the baby, I said. Whatever happened between you and Rachel, whatever she did to me or to you, that child is innocent. They didn't choose any of this. Matthew nodded heavily. I know. I've thought about nothing else. I don't know how to be a father to a child whose mother I can barely stand to look at, but I know I have to try. Be the father that breaks the cycle, I told him. Your child is going to grow up hearing stories about what happened. Make sure they also see an example of how to handle conflict with integrity. Show them that accountability matters, but so does compassion. That's how you make things right. He looked at me with gratitude and regret mingled together. You should have been the one, Dana. We should have had a life together. I'm sorry I let Rachel take that from us. I shook my head gently. We can't live in should-haves. The past is done. All we can do is make better choices going forward. Focus on being a good father. That's what matters now. Tyler drove me to the airport that evening. We didn't talk much during the ride, both of us lost in our own thoughts. But as we pulled up to the departure terminal, he reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. Mum asked me to give you this, he said. She's been keeping it for 10 years, but was never brave enough to send it. After everything that happened, she thought you should finally have it. I took the envelope, feeling the weight of it in my hands. It was addressed to me in my mother's handwriting, the ink faded with age. Whatever was inside had been written a decade ago and hidden away, waiting for a moment that had finally arrived. What is it? I asked. I don't know, Tyler admitted. She just said it was something you deserved to read. The envelope sat in my lap for the entire boarding process. I watched passengers file past my seat, stowing luggage and settling in for the flight back to Seattle. And still, I couldn't bring myself to open it. 10 years! My mother had written something to me 10 years ago and kept it hidden all this time. Whatever was inside had been waiting for me since the Thanksgiving, when I brought Matthew home, the last moment of pure happiness I could remember before everything fell apart. The plane lifted off and Ohio shrank beneath the clouds. Only then did I finally slide my finger under the seal and pull out the contents. Inside were 2 pieces of paper. The first was yellowed with age, the ink slightly faded, dated almost exactly 10 years ago. The second was newer, written recently in the same handwriting, but with a shakier hand. I read the older letter first. Dear Dana, it began. I'm writing this the day after Thanksgiving while you're upstairs sleeping, and Matthew is in the guest room, and the whole house still smells like turkey and pumpkin pie. I should be happy. For the first time in years, all my children were home together, and you brought someone special to meet us. I could see how much you love him and how much he loves you. I should feel nothing but joy for my firstborn daughter. But I can't sleep because I'm crying and I don't want anyone to hear. When I saw you with Matthew, when I watched how he looked at you like you were the most important person in the world, something broke inside me. Not in a bad way exactly, more like a crack in a wall that had been holding back water for 30 years. All the feelings I thought I had buried came flooding through. You are so much like me, Dana. Or rather, you are like the person I was supposed to be before life got in the way. You're brilliant and driven and independent. You built a career on your own terms. You found love without settling for whoever was convenient. You became everything I dreamed of being before I was told those dreams weren't appropriate for a woman like me. I should celebrate you. I should be the proudest mother in the world. Instead, I look at you and see everything I lost. Every opportunity I was denied, every dream I had to bury. You are the version of me I was never allowed to become. And instead of feeling joy, I feel grief and envy and shame. I know this is wrong. I know a mother should lift her daughter up, not resent her for succeeding. I know the feelings I have say everything about my own failures and nothing about you. But knowing something and feeling something are two different things, and I haven't figured out how to make my heart follow my head. I want to tell you I'm proud of you. I want to tell you that your happiness makes me happy. I want to be the mother you deserve, but every time I try, the words stick in my throat. I see your success, and I feel my own failure. I see your freedom, and I feel my own chains. I see your future, and I mourn my own past. You are not responsible for any of this. You have done nothing wrong. The problem is entirely mine, and I'm writing this letter because I need to get it out somewhere, even if I can never send it. I'm sorry, Dana. I'm sorry for the mother I couldn't be. I'm sorry for the distance I created between us. I'm sorry for every time I made you feel less than loved, less than valued, less than worthy. You deserved better. You still deserve better. And maybe someday I'll find the courage to tell you all of this out loud. But tonight, I'm just a broken woman crying in her kitchen at 2 a.m, wishing she could be different. I love you. I have always loved you. Even when I couldn't show it, even when I pushed you away, the love was there underneath all the complicated feelings. I hope you know that, even if I never find the words to say it. Mum, I had to stop reading because I couldn't see through the tears. The letter shook in my hands as decades of confusion suddenly made sense. All those years of wondering why my mother treated me the way she did, all those nights lying awake trying to figure out what I had done wrong. She had written the answer 10 years ago and hidden it in a drawer, too afraid to let me see her truth. I wiped my eyes and picked up the second piece of paper, the recent note attached to the letter. Dana, it read. I was never brave enough to send this. Every time I thought about giving it to you, I convinced myself it would only make things worse. Better to keep my shame private than burden you with my complicated feelings. But after everything that happened at Christmas, after I finally told you the truth about why I failed you, I realized you deserved to know that I always saw you. Even when I pretended not to. Even when I let Rachel hurt you. Even when I made you feel invisible. This letter is proof that I struggled with my feelings, that part of me always knew I was wrong. It's not an excuse. Nothing can excuse what I allowed to happen. But maybe it helps to know that the love was always there, buried under all the fear and envy and shame. I hope it's not too late. I hope we can still become the mother and daughter we should have been all along. I love you, Dana. I'm finally brave enough to say it out loud. Mum. I cried for the rest of the flight, not from pain this time, but from something more complicated. Relief, recognition. the bittersweet feeling of finally being seen by someone who had spent decades looking away. When we landed in Seattle, I pulled out my phone and started typing a response. "Mum," I wrote, "thank you for finally sending this. It helps more than you know to understand what was happening inside you all those years. It doesn't erase the hurt, but it helps me see you as a whole person instead of just someone who failed me. It's not too late, but change has to be real, not just words. Show me through your actions that you're committed to being different. Support me when it's hard. Stand up for truth even when it's uncomfortable. Be the mother you wished you could be starting now. I'm willing to try if you are." Dana. The months that followed were quieter than I expected. I had braced myself for more drama, more confrontations, more chaos spilling over from Ohio into my Seattle life. Instead, there was stillness. The kind of stillness that comes after a storm has finally passed, leaving the world washed clean and strangely unfamiliar. I threw myself into work with renewed energy. Without the constant background noise of family dysfunction draining my reserves, I discovered capacities I hadn't known I possessed. My projects came together more smoothly. My ideas flowed more freely. My colleagues noticed the change, commenting that I seemed lighter, somehow more present in meetings and conversations. 3 months after Christmas, my manager called me into her office with news that made me sit down before my knees gave out. "The board approved your promotion," she said, smiling broadly. "Starting next month, you'll be our new Director of Engineering. You'll be leading a team of 40 people across 3 departments." I stared at her, temporarily speechless. Director of Engineering was a position I had dreamed about, but never truly believed I would achieve. For years, I had convinced myself that my family situation, the instability, the constant emotional drain would always hold me back. Now here I was, being handed exactly what I had worked toward for my entire career. The company held a small ceremony to announce the promotion. Standing at the front of a conference room filled with colleagues and executives, I was expected to give a brief acceptance speech. I had prepared remarks about team collaboration and strategic vision, the usual corporate language that such occasions demanded. But when I opened my mouth, different words came out. "I want to share something with all of you." I began, my voice steady despite the emotion swirling inside me. For most of my life, I believed my value depended on whether other people recognized it. I worked hard, achieved goals, and constantly looked for validation from people who were never going to give it. I thought if I just accomplished enough, I would finally earn the acknowledgement I craved. The room was quiet, everyone watching me with curious expressions. "I was wrong," I continued. "Your value isn't determined by who sees it. It isn't measured by applause or promotions or praise. Your value comes from knowing who you are and doing right, because it's right, not because someone is watching. The most important work I've ever done was work nobody recognized. The most meaningful choices I've made were choices that earned me nothing except the knowledge that I had stayed true to myself." I looked around the room at faces I had worked alongside for years. This promotion is wonderful and I'm grateful for it. But I want you all to know that I would have kept doing my best work, even if it never came. Because that's who I am. That's who I choose to be. And I hope each of you knows your own worth, regardless of what titles you hold or recognition you receive. The applause that followed felt different from any I had received before. It felt earned, not for the position I had achieved, but for the truth I had finally been able to speak. In the weeks after my promotion, I started something new. I began mentoring young women engineers who reminded me of myself at their age, bright and ambitious, but uncertain of their place in a field that often made them feel invisible. I shared my story with them not for sympathy, but as proof that surviving difficulty didn't have to define your future. You can come from dysfunction and still build something healthy, I told them. You can be underestimated your whole life and still exceed every expectation. The people who doubted you don't get to write the ending of your story. You do. One evening in early spring, Tyler sent me a video message. It was from a birthday gathering at my parents' house, some cousin's child turning 8 or 10. The camera panned across familiar faces, now relatives I hadn't seen in person since Christmas, all of them smiling and waving. Then, my mother appeared on screen, looking directly into the camera with an expression I had never seen her wear before. Part sadness, part pride, part something that might have been hope. "Dana," she said, her voice slightly trembling, "we miss you. The whole family misses you. I know you can't be here and I understand why, but I wanted you to know that we're thinking of you." She paused, gathering herself. "Happy birthday to my strongest daughter," she continued, and tears began streaming down her face even as she smiled. "I'm so proud of you, Dana. I should have said it 1,000 times before. I should have said it every day of your life. But I'm saying it now, and I'll keep saying it for as long as I live. I'm proud of you." The video ended, and I sat staring at my laptop screen for a long time. Something had shifted in my heart without me noticing. A year ago, hearing those words from my mother would have meant everything to me. I would have clung to them desperately, finally receiving the validation I had craved my entire life. But now, watching the video in my Seattle apartment, I felt something different. Appreciation, yes. Gratitude that she was trying, but not the desperate need I once would have felt. I didn't need her acknowledgement anymore to know my own worth. I had learned to see myself clearly independent of how my family saw me. Their recognition was welcome, but it wasn't essential. My foundation was built on something sturdier now. I smiled, closed my laptop, and went to make dinner. Peace tasted different than I had imagined. Quieter, less triumphant, but deeper, somehow rooted in something that couldn't be taken away. A week later, an email arrived that would change the trajectory of my healing journey. "Dear Ms. Holland," it began, "my name is Patricia Simmons, and I'm the director of the annual Women Rising Conference. We bring together thousands of women each year to share stories of resilience, empowerment, and overcoming adversity. Your story has come to our attention through several sources. We understand you have experienced significant family betrayal and emerged stronger on the other side. We believe your journey could inspire and help countless women who are struggling with similar situations. We would be honoured if you would consider speaking at our conference this October. Your voice could make a tremendous difference to women who feel trapped, invisible, or undervalued by the people who should love them most." I read the email 3 times before setting down my phone. My story, shared with thousands of strangers. The most painful experiences of my life transformed into something that might help others. A year passed faster than I expected. Seasons changed, projects launched, life continued its steady march forward. I found myself settling into a rhythm I had never known before, a pattern of days that felt earned rather than survived. My apartment in Seattle became a true home instead of just a place to sleep between crises. My work fulfilled me in ways I was finally able to appreciate. And for the first time in my memory, I could think about my family without feeling the old familiar tightness in my chest. Tyler remained my primary source of news from Ohio. Our weekly phone calls had become a tradition. I looked forward to 2 siblings slowly building the relationship we should have had all along. Through him, I learned that Rachel had finally started therapy. "She's been going for 8 months now," Tyler told me during one of our calls. "Twice a week, real intensive work. At first, she just complained about everything and blamed everyone else. But her therapist is good. She's making Rachel actually look at herself." I asked how Rachel was handling that process. "Hard," Tyler admitted. "There's been a lot of crying, a lot of difficult realizations. She's starting to see how her insecurity and envy drove her to do terrible things. She's starting to understand that destroying you was really about hating herself." I processed this information carefully. Part of me remained skeptical, waiting for Rachel to abandon the work as soon as it got too uncomfortable. But another part recognized that genuine change was possible even for someone who had spent her whole life running from accountability. "She asked about you," Tyler continued hesitantly. "She wanted to know if there was any chance you might talk to her someday. Not now, she knows that. But eventually." I told Tyler I wasn't ready for that conversation yet, and I didn't know if I ever would be. Trust that had been destroyed so completely couldn't be rebuilt with 8 months of therapy. Maybe years from now, if Rachel continued to do the work, if her change proved genuine over time, we could attempt some kind of careful reconnection. But I refused to rush the process or pretend forgiveness I hadn't truly achieved. Rachel's daughter was born in early spring, a healthy baby girl named Emma. Tyler sent me photos from the hospital, and I found myself surprisingly moved by the tiny face in the pictures. This child was my niece, innocent of everything that had happened, deserving of a chance at a functional family, even if the adults around her had failed so spectacularly. Matthew had kept his word about being a present father. Despite the divorce, he was at the hospital for Emma's birth and continued to be actively involved in her care. Tyler reported that he and Rachel had worked out a civil co-parenting arrangement, setting aside their personal animosity for their daughter's sake. "He's breaking the cycle," Tyler observed. "Our dad was never really there, always physically present, but emotionally absent. Matthew is determined to be different. I thought about our father, about his confession, that he had seen everything and said nothing about his lifetime of choosing the path of least resistance. Matthew, learning from those mistakes, felt like something worth celebrating, a small redemption born from larger failures. My mother and I had continued our careful process of rebuilding. We spoke on the phone every few weeks now, conversations that were sometimes awkward but always honest. She was seeing a therapist too, working through the buried dreams and resentments that had poisoned her relationships with her children. Progress was slow, but it was real. A package arrived from Ohio on a Tuesday afternoon. I recognized my mother's handwriting on the label and opened it with curiosity. Inside was not a formal memoir, as I might have expected, but a worn leather journal, the kind with a built-in ribbon bookmark, and pages yellowed by decades of handling. A note was attached. "Dana," it read. "This is my personal journal. I've been writing in it for 30 years. I want you to have it now because I think it's time you understood your mother completely, not just the parts I let you see." I spent the next 3 evenings reading through those pages. They documented her entire adult life from her wedding day, through raising children, through all the years I had felt invisible in her presence. I read about her private struggles, her suppressed dreams, her complicated feelings about each of her children. I read about the day she gave up her scholarship and the hollow ache that followed her for years afterward. The most recent entries were the most difficult to read. They showed a woman in painful self-examination, confronting truths she had spent decades avoiding. She wrote about her jealousy of me with unflinching honesty. She wrote about her guilt over enabling Rachel. She wrote about her determination to become better, even if it was too late to undo the damage she had caused. The final entry made me cry. "I used to think Dana was the version of me I couldn't become," she had written. The daughter who achieved everything I was denied. I resented her for it. I pushed her away because her success reminded me of my failures. But I was wrong. Dana is not the version of me I couldn't become. She is something better, something entirely her own. She built her strength not because of me, but despite me. She became extraordinary not by following my path, but by forging her own. I am ashamed of the mother I was, but I am so proud of the woman my daughter became. I closed the journal and sat quietly for a long time, letting the weight of her words settle into my heart. Then I opened my laptop and began composing a response. "Mum," I wrote, "thank you for sharing your journal with me. Reading it helped me understand you in ways I never did before. I can see now that you were fighting battles I knew nothing about, drowning in grief and regret that you never let anyone see. Thank you for finally seeing me. But I hope you're also learning to see yourself with compassion. You made terrible mistakes. So did I in different ways. So does everyone. The question isn't whether we fail, but whether we learn from our failures and try to do better. It's never too late to become who you were meant to be. I believe that about myself, and I believe it about you too." I sent the email and turned to look at the invitation sitting on my desk. The Women Rising conference was 3 weeks away, and I had finally accepted their request to speak. Thousands of women would gather to hear stories of resilience and survival, and I would stand before them and share mine. The question I had been asked to address seemed simple on the surface, but contained depths I was still exploring. When your own family betrays you, how do you survive? The conference hall was larger than I had imagined. 500 women filled the seats, their faces turned toward the stage where I stood behind a simple podium. The lights were bright enough that I couldn't see individual expressions, but I could feel the energy in the room, the collective presence of people who had gathered to hear stories of survival and strength. I had spent weeks preparing my remarks, writing and rewriting, trying to capture truths that felt too big for words. But standing there in that moment, looking out at all those expectant faces, I set my notes aside and spoke from somewhere deeper. I was uninvited from Christmas dinner, I began. My mother called 3 weeks before the holiday and told me my sister's new husband thought I would ruin the vibe. What she didn't tell me was that the husband in question was my former boyfriend, a man my sister had stolen from me through lies and manipulation years earlier. What she didn't tell me was that my entire family had been complicit in erasing me from their lives, rewriting history to make me the villain in a story where I was actually the victim. The room was utterly silent. For 10 years, I kept quiet. I protected people who didn't deserve protection. I swallowed my truth because I thought silence was strength, because I believed that keeping the peace was more important than speaking my pain. I was wrong. I paused, letting the words settle. Someone asked me to answer a question today. When your own family betrays you, how do you survive? I've thought about this question for months and I've realised there's no single answer, but I can tell you what worked for me. I gripped the podium lightly, grounding myself. You survive by stopping the effort to make them understand you. I spent years trying to prove my worth to people who had already decided I was worthless. I exhausted myself seeking validation from sources that were never going to provide it. The turning point came when I realised I was asking the wrong question. Instead of asking, how can I make them see me, I started asking, how can I see myself clearly, regardless of what they think? I looked out at the audience, knowing that many of them were fighting the same battles I had fought. Understanding yourself is the foundation everything else builds on. When you know your own worth, when you can look in the mirror and see someone valuable without needing external confirmation, then betrayal loses its power over you. It still hurts. It still matters. But it doesn't define you anymore. A woman in the front row was crying quietly. Others were nodding recognition written across their faces. People often ask me about forgiveness, I continued. They want to know if I forgave my mother, my sister, the man I loved who chose lies over me. The answer is complicated. Forgiveness isn't a single moment or a simple decision. It's a process that unfolds over time and it looks different for everyone. I took a breath before continuing. What I've learned is that forgiveness isn't for them. It's for you. Carrying hatred and resentment is exhausting. It poisons your present while keeping you chained to your past. Forgiveness means putting down that burden so you can walk forward with lighter steps. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting what happened. It doesn't mean pretending everything is fine. And it absolutely doesn't mean returning to relationships where you'll be hurt again. I thought about Rachel, about my mother, about all the complicated feelings I still carried. You can forgive someone and still choose not to have them in your life. You can release your anger and still maintain boundaries. Forgiveness and self-protection are not opposites. They can coexist. The audience seemed to lean forward, collectively hungry for these words. If I have one regret, I said, my voice softening, it's that I didn't speak sooner. I thought my silence was noble, that I was taking the high road by not exposing the people who hurt me. But silence didn't protect me. It protected them. It allowed lies to flourish while truth withered in darkness. I shook my head slowly. Truth is uncomfortable. Speaking up creates conflict and disrupts relationships and forces people to confront things they would rather ignore. But living buried under lies is worse. You cannot build a healthy life on a foundation of deception. Eventually, the truth will find its way out, and when it does, the damage is far greater than it would have been if honesty had come first. I straightened my shoulders and looked directly into the lights. So here is what I want to leave you with. Your worth is not determined by who sees it. The people who should love you most may fail you completely. That failure is theirs, not yours. You are not responsible for their inability to recognize your value. I felt tears prickling at my own eyes, but let them come. Speak your truth, even when your voice shakes. Protect yourself, even when others call you selfish. Walk away from relationships that diminish you, even when the world tells you family is everything. And know deep in your bones that surviving betrayal is not weakness. It is the greatest strength there is. The applause that followed was thunderous. I stood at the podium as the sound washed over me, feeling something I hadn't expected. Not pride exactly, but completeness. The most painful chapters of my life had been transformed into something that might help others. My suffering had found purpose. After the session ended, I stepped down from the stage and was immediately surrounded by women who wanted to share their own stories, thank me for my words, or simply shake my hand. I listened to each one, offered what comfort I could, and felt the profound connection that comes from shared experience. One young woman waited until the crowd had thinned before approaching. She couldn't have been more than 25, with red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands. "Your story helped me," she said, her voice barely audible. "I've been in a relationship where I was constantly told I was crazy, that my feelings weren't valid, that I was the problem. Hearing you talk about how your sister manipulated everyone into believing her lies made me realize what was happening to me. I left him last month. I'm staying with my aunt now." She started crying in earnest. "Thank you for showing me that walking away is strength, not weakness. Thank you for helping me see that I deserve better." I embraced her without hesitation, holding this stranger who had become a sister in pain and survival. "Your courage saved you," I told her gently. "I just helped you see what was already inside you." After the last attendee had departed, I walked out of the conference centre into the afternoon sunlight. The October air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, tilting my face toward the sky, feeling the warmth on my skin. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from my mother. "I watched your speech online," she had written. "I cried through the whole thing. And I am so proud of you, Dana. More proud than I have ever been of anything in my life." I read the message twice, smiled softly, and slipped the phone back into my pocket, without replying immediately. There would be time for responses later. Right now, I just wanted to be present in this moment, to feel the sun and breathe the air and know that I had made it through to the other side. I started walking, no particular destination in mind, just moving forward, because forward was the only direction that mattered anymore. Silence was once my shield. I used it to protect myself from a family that couldn't see my worth, from a world that demanded I shrink to make others comfortable. But now, truth is the clearest voice I have. It carried me through betrayal and loss and years of invisible suffering. It brought me here to this moment, to this freedom I never thought I would find. I don't need anyone to see me to know I exist. I don't need to defeat anyone to know my worth. I don't need applause or acknowledgement or validation from people who failed me. I just need to live. Authentically, unapologetically, free. And that is exactly what I intend to do. And so ends Dana's remarkable journey, a story that proves the deepest wounds in life often come not from strangers or enemies, but from the very people who should love us most unconditionally. For 10 long and painful years, Dana Holland lived buried under a mountain of lies her own sister had carefully constructed brick by brick. She watched helplessly as Rachel stole the man she loved through fabricated text messages and calculated manipulation that destroyed what should have been a beautiful future. She lost a promising career to anonymous accusations she never knew existed, spending months and years questioning what she had done wrong, when the truth was she had done absolutely nothing at all. She became invisible at her own family gatherings, seated at corner tables, with distant relatives who barely remembered her name, blamed for tensions she never created, and eventually erased from photo albums, as if her presence in the family had been nothing more than an inconvenient mistake that needed to be corrected. The betrayal came not just from Rachel, but from every person who should have protected Dana and stood by her side. Her mother knew the truth about the fake messages, about the career sabotage, about years of systematic destruction aimed at her eldest daughter, and chose silence to protect the golden child she had always favoured. Her father saw everything unfolding before his eyes and said nothing because confrontation was too uncomfortable and peace was easier than justice. Even the man she loved, the man she had planned a future with, accepted lies about her mental stability and supposed obsession without ever reaching out to verify the truth or hear her side of the story. Dana was surrounded by people who claimed to be family, but treated her like a stranger they wished would simply disappear from their lives forever. But here is what makes Dana's story truly extraordinary and worth telling. Through every betrayal, every moment of crushing invisibility, every knife planted firmly and deliberately in her back, she never lost the core of who she was as a person. When her brother Tyler needed help with college tuition, and their parents claimed they couldn't afford it, she paid every dollar anonymously without expecting thanks or recognition. When her parents faced losing their family home to foreclosure after her father's accident, she cleared their entire debt through an intermediary legal company, letting them believe the bank had simply shown mercy and granted an extension. When her sister's husband's startup company was on the verge of complete collapse, threatening to create a financial disaster that would ultimately burden her aging parents, who would feel obligated to rescue Rachel, she invested $200,000 of her own savings to save it. Not out of lingering love for Matthew, the man who had abandoned her based on lies, not to earn points with a family that refused to see her worth, but because Dana understood something profound that took her years to learn. Her worth was never determined by whether other people acknowledged her actions or appreciated her sacrifices. She did the right things because they were right, not for applause, not for recognition, not for the validation she had spent her entire childhood and adult life craving from people who were never going to provide it, no matter what she accomplished. In the end, Dana didn't need revenge. She didn't need to destroy anyone or burn bridges or unleash years of suppressed fury in some dramatic confrontation. She only needed the truth to finally breathe after being suffocated and buried for an entire decade. And when that truth emerged at the Christmas gathering she was never supposed to attend, when Rachel's own recorded voice echoed through the living room, confessing in precise detail exactly how she had stolen Matthew and deliberately ruined Dana's life, simply because she was jealous, the elaborate web of lies collapsed completely under its own weight. Rachel lost her marriage because Matthew finally saw the true nature of the woman he had spent 8 years not really knowing at all. She lost her social standing because friends and extended family could no longer pretend ignorance about who she really was. She lost the protective shield of her mother's unconditional favoritism because even the most willful blindness has its limits when truth speaks loudly enough. Not because Dana attacked her or orchestrated some elaborate revenge scheme planned over years, but simply because deception cannot survive when light finally touches it and exposes it for what it always was. Dana walked away from that Christmas, not with hatred burning in her heart, but with something far more valuable and lasting: freedom. The kind of freedom that comes from no longer needing anyone's approval to know your own worth as a human being. The kind of freedom that emerges when you stop shrinking yourself to make others comfortable and start living fully as the complete person you were always meant to be. The kind of freedom that arrives when you finally speak your truth boldly after a lifetime of protective silence that only served to shield the people hurting you. She went on to become director of engineering, leading a team of 40 talented people. She mentored young women who reminded her of herself at their age, sharing her story, not for sympathy, but as proof that survival and success were possible. She stood before 500 strangers at a women's conference and shared the hard-won wisdom that pain and perseverance had taught her. And she began slowly and carefully, with appropriate boundaries, to rebuild relationships with family members who were finally willing to see her clearly for the first time. Not everyone gets a happy ending. Not every betrayal leads to justice or resolution. But Dana's story reminds us powerfully that survival is always possible, that healing happens even when forgiveness takes years or never fully arrives, and that the people who try to bury us often end up providing the very soil from which we grow stronger than ever before. Thank you so much for staying with me through all 25 parts of this emotional and powerful journey. Your time and attention mean everything to this channel, and I am deeply and sincerely grateful for every single one of you who listened from the first word to the very last. If Dana's story touched your heart, if you found yourself crying during her mother's devastating confession about jealousy, or cheering loudly when Rachel's carefully constructed lies were finally exposed for all to see, if you recognised painful pieces of your own family struggles in these chapters, I want to hear from you. Please, leave a comment below and share which moment affected you the most deeply. Was it the discovery of the fake breakup message that cruelly separated Dana and Matthew for an entire decade? The heartbreaking revelation that her own mother had been jealous of her daughter's success all along? The powerful scene where Dana stood before hundreds of women and declared that her worth was never dependent on anyone else's recognition or approval? Tell me what moved you to tears. Tell me what made you angry on Dana's behalf. Tell me if you have your own story of a surviving family betrayal that you want to share with our community. Every comment you leave, every like you give, every time you share this story with a friend or family member who might need to hear it, helps other listeners discover Dana's incredible journey. You might be helping someone who is currently living their own version of this nightmare finally realize they are not alone in their suffering. You might be giving someone the courage they desperately need to speak their own truth after years of damaging silence. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel and tap that notification bell so you never miss a new story when it arrives. We bring you tales of family drama, hidden betrayals, shocking revelations, and the incredible resilience of ordinary people who refuse to be broken by those who should have protected and loved them. New stories arrive regularly, each one carefully crafted to take you on an emotional journey you won't soon forget. Until next time, carry Dana's final words with you, wherever you go in life. Silence was once her shield, but truth became her clearest and most powerful voice. She learned that she didn't need anyone to see her to know she existed and mattered. She didn't need to defeat anyone to know her true worth. She didn't need applause or recognition or validation from people who had failed her so completely. She just needed to live authentically, unapologetically, completely and beautifully free. May you find that same freedom in your own life. May you have the courage to speak your truth when silence is no longer serving you well. And may you always remember that surviving betrayal is not weakness. It is the greatest strength there is. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves and each other, and I will see you in the next story.